Hello, and welcome back to the Midnight Historian. In the last cold hour before dawn, on a morning somewhere around 2,500 years ago, a herder stood alone on a high shoulder of rock above a valley on the Iranian plateau and watched a thread of water come down out of the dark. He had walked up here in the blue before sunrise, as his father had done, and his father's father before that, because the snows on the great mountains to the north were beginning to melt at last, and the whole small world he knew was waiting for the water to find its way down the stone channels men had cut into the mountainside long before anyone could remember. Channels so old that the digging of them belonged not to history but to story. And now, at last, it was coming. The water, which for the long dry months had been only a rumor somewhere far above him, buried in the roots of the mountains, was moving again in the dark tunnels his ancestors had bored into the hills, sliding down through the rock at a grade so gentle and so exact that the men who had planned it must have carried the whole slope of the land inside their heads. And it was surfacing now in the little stone mouth at the head of his valley and beginning, patiently, to spread out across the terraces below, feeding the barley, feeding the almond trees, feeding the small mud brick houses where his children still slept. He did not know in any way he could have said aloud how large the thing he belonged to had become. He knew his valley, and the next valley, and the road that ran east toward the salt desert and west toward the mountains. And he knew that somewhere far away, in a place he would never see, there was a king of a kind the world had never held before, whose messengers rode the roads on horses that were changed fresh at stations a day apart, so that a word from the edge of the world could reach the center faster than any word had ever traveled. And he knew that this king, whoever he truly was, called himself not merely king, but king of kings, king of countries containing all kinds of men, and that the herder himself, standing on his cold rock watching the water come down, was one small grain in the countless multitude those words were meant to hold. His name was never written down. No relief on any palace wall preserves his face among the endless carved processions of subject peoples climbing the stairs of the great terrace with their tribute. And yet everything in the story you are about to hear, every carved stairway and gold drinking horn and winged stone bull, every road and every royal tomb cut into a cliff, every clay tablet recording a ration of wine paid to a working woman, rests entirely on the shoulders of that one anonymous man and the millions like him, watching the water come down in the early light, keeping alive the terraces that fed the greatest empire the world had yet seen. This is the story of the Persian Empire, and before we go any further, it is worth pausing to take in the sheer, almost improbable scale of what those words meant when they were new. When we talk about the Persian Empire, and specifically the first of them, the one historians call the Achaemenid, after the family that ruled it, we are not talking about a kingdom of a single people in a single land. We are talking about the first true world empire in human history, the first state that ever gathered under one crown the ancient river civilizations of Mesopotamia and the Nile, the mountain kingdoms of Anatolia, the horse peoples of the northern steppes, the merchant cities of the Phoenician coast, the Greek towns of the Aegean shore, and the far valleys of the Indus, a realm that in its widest hour stretched from the Balkans to the edge of India, from the deserts of Libya to the rivers of Central Asia, and held within its borders, by one modern estimate that historians repeat with the caution it deserves, something close to half of every human being then alive on Earth. Half of the living species, under one administration, speaking dozens of languages, worshipping hundreds of gods, and knit together not by a single faith or a single tongue, but by roads, by records, and by an idea. It had never been done. Nothing on its scale would be attempted again for centuries. And it was built, in the span of a single human lifetime, by a man who began as the ruler of a minor people paying tribute to their neighbors, and who died as the master of the largest realm the world had ever known, and whom even his enemies, the Greeks who would spend generations trying to destroy what he had made, could not bring themselves to describe as anything less than great. Before we ride out across the plateau together, take a quiet moment to like this video and to subscribe. but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, the slow unrolling of the long past in the dark. And if you feel like it, leave your location and your local time down in the comments. It helps other restless, sleepless people find their way to this small corner of the night, and there is something pleasant, I think, in knowing that somewhere far away, a stranger is settling under the same dark sky, at some strange hour of their own, listening to the same slow story. So get comfortable, let your shoulders sink down into the bed, and let yourself ease into the tale of the First World Empire, the kings who ruled by what they called the truth, the road that ran for 1,500 miles, the war with the little Greek cities that the world has remembered backward for 2,500 years, and the strange, patient way a whole empire's own voice was lost, and its enemy's version believed in its place, until, almost by accident, a man hanging from a rope on the face of a cliff gave it back its speech. To understand anything at all about Persia, we cannot begin with kings, or with battles, or with the burning of palaces. We have to begin, as we always must, with the land, because the Persians, like every people who ever built something that lasted, were shaped first and most deeply by the ground they stood on. And the ground they stood on was like almost no other ground from which a great civilization has ever risen. Egypt, as we spent a long night learning, was the gift of a river, a narrow green thread of impossible fertility drawn through a dead desert, a place of such reliable abundance that its people came, reasonably, to believe the natural state of the world was order and plenty. The heartland of Persia was almost the opposite kind of place, and the difference is written into everything the Persians became. The Iranian plateau is a vast, high, dry tableland, lifted a mile and more above the seas that surround it, and ringed on nearly every side by great walls of mountains, the Zagros running down its western flank in fold after parallel fold, like the creases of a piece of crushed cloth, the Elbers curving along the north above the Caspian, and lesser ranges closing off the east. Inside that ring of mountains lies a high, cold, thirsty interior, and at its center, where you might expect the beating green heart of the country to be, there is instead a pair of the most hostile deserts on the face of the earth. The Dasht-e-Kavir, a great salt waste, and the Dasht-e-Lut, a stone and sand furnace where, in our own age, the hottest land surface temperatures ever recorded anywhere on the planet have been measured. Ground so hot that nothing lives on it at all. Not a lizard, not an insect, not a blade of anything. The Persian homeland, in other words, was not a river valley handed its harvest each year by a patient god. It was a rim of habitable country clinging to the edges of a dead center, a land of high valleys and mountain skirts where water came not as a broad annual flood, but as snowmelt off the peaks in spring, precious, seasonal, and always in danger of running short. And here we meet the first great invention of the plateau, the thing that made Persia possible. And it was not a temple, or a weapon, or a law. It was a hole in the ground, or rather a whole hidden architecture of holes, the most patient and least visible engineering the ancient world ever produced. The problem the plateau set its people was simple and cruel. The water was up in the mountains, locked in the snow and in the gravel of the high slopes, and the land where you wanted to grow, your barley was down on the plain, and if you simply dug an open canal from one to the other and let the water run across the hot, thirsty surface under that blazing sun, most of it would soak away into the ground or steam off into the sky before it ever reached your field. So the Persians, and the peoples who came before them on the plateau, did something extraordinary. They went underground. They found the water table high up on the slope at the foot of the mountains, and then they dug a tunnel, a gently sloping tunnel, running for miles down under the surface of the plain, carrying the water in the cool and the dark where the sun could not steal it, surfacing at last, by the pull of gravity alone, exactly where it was needed, in a stone channel at the head of a village's fields. They called this a qanat, and to build one was the labor of years and sometimes of generations, and the danger of it is difficult to overstate, because a man had to crawl down a vertical shaft into the earth and dig horizontally in the dark, in a tunnel barely wider than his own shoulders, with the constant risk of the roof coming down on him, and the workers who did it had a grim, honest name for their trade. They were, in effect, the ones who dug their own possible graves, and the vertical shafts sunk at intervals along the line of the tunnel, which looked from the air like a long row of antlion pits marching across the desert toward the hills, were dug both to bring up the spoil and to give the diggers air, and to let the surveyors, working with nothing but a plumb line and a lamp and an inherited, almost unbelievable feel for the slope of the invisible, keep the whole buried river running true. I want you to sit with the Khanate for a moment, because it will tell you more about the Persian character than any battle. It is not a monument. It does not rise into the sky to be seen and admired. Almost nothing of it shows above the ground but a line of low dirt rings and a single modest stone mouth where the water comes out, and a man could ride across a valley watered by a great Khanate and never guess, unless he knew, that beneath his horse's feet a river was running quietly downhill through the dark. A river that men had planned and cut and roofed and tended for 100 years. The whole genius of it is hidden, patient, and useful, and it asks of the people who depend on it not a single act of glory, but an endless, shared, unglamorous discipline, because a Khanate that no one maintains silts up and dies and takes a village with it. The plateau taught the Persians, at the very root of who they were, that survival was a matter of managing scarce water across great distance through patient, cooperative, invisible work. And that lesson, I think, ran all the way up from the herder on his rock to the king of kings on his throne, because the empire that the Persians eventually built was, in its deepest nature, a kind of enormous Khanate, a hidden architecture for moving something precious across vast distances without losing it to the waste in between, ruled not by the man who shouts loudest in the marketplace, but by the quiet, patient, endlessly maintained systems that carry the water down. There was one more gift the geography gave, and like the deserts, it was double-edged, and it ran through the whole of Persian history. The plateau sat at the crossroads of the ancient world. To its west lay the old, rich, exhausted civilizations of Mesopotamia, and beyond them the Mediterranean. To its northeast, across the mountains, lay the endless grass sea of the Central Asian steppe, home to the horse peoples the Persians called the Saka, and the Greeks called the Scythians, restless, mounted, and free. To its southeast lay the passes into India. Persia was not off in a protected corner like Egypt behind its walls of sand. It was in the middle of everything, a great high platform astride the roads between the settled south and the wild north, between the sunset lands and the sunrise lands, and this meant that Persia was always in contact, always trading and learning and borrowing and fighting, never able to become, as Egypt became, a serene and self-sufficient world unto itself. The Persians grew up worldly, in the oldest sense of that word, a people of the roads and the passes, and when they finally turned their crossroads position from a danger into a strength, when they stopped being the ones the roads brought invaders to and became the ones who owned the roads, the result was the first empire in history that thought of itself, without embarrassment, as belonging to the whole world. But that turning was a long way off. For now, in the deep morning of the story, the plateau was a patchwork of peoples clinging to their watered valleys, herding on the high slopes, tending their buried rivers, and paying, when they had to, tribute to older and grander powers who thought of the highland folk, when they thought of them at all, as useful, hardy, and safely unimportant. It is tempting, and the Persians themselves rather encourage this, to imagine that Persia sprang suddenly and gloriously into being with one great king, that before Cyrus there was only darkness, and after him only light. The truth, as the truth generally is, was slower, older, and more crowded, and it deserves telling, because the empire the Persians built stood on foundations laid by peoples who are now almost entirely forgotten, whose names, when they survive at all, survive mostly as footnotes to the story of their conquerors. Long before there was a Persia, there was Elam. Down in the southwest of the plateau and the plains below it, in the land that would later hold the Persian city of Susa, there had lived for thousands of years, since the very dawn of cities, a people who were not Persian and not Mesopotamian, and not anything else we can neatly name, a people whose language stands alone, related to nothing, a genuine mystery, and who had built cities and temples and a script of their own back in the ages when the pyramids of Egypt were new. The Elamites were one of the oldest civilizations on Earth, contemporaries of the first Sumerian city-states, rivals and sometimes conquerors of Babylon, builders of a great stepped temple tower that still rises out of the plain, and they had spent well over 2,000 years being a major power in the world before the Persians were anything at all. And it is one of the quiet injustices of history that almost no one now has heard their name, because the people who eventually inherited their land and their cities, and much of their civilization, the Persians, would grow so vast and so famous that they swallowed the memory of their teachers whole. When the Persian kings later kept their records, they often kept them in the Elamite language, borrowed from the people they had absorbed. When they built their great capital of Susa, they built it on an Elamite mound, and much of what looks purely Persian in the story to come is in truth a Persian roof laid over Elamite walls. Hold Elam gently in your mind as we go, the way one holds the memory of a grandparent one never met, because it is the deepest layer of this ground, and it was there before everything. Into this old world, sometime in the ages before our story properly begins, came new peoples. And here we touch one of the great slow migrations of the ancient world, the drift of the speakers of the Indo-Iranian languages down out of the north, off the great steppe, onto the plateau, over centuries so long and undramatic that no memory of them survives except in the languages themselves. These were pastoral peoples, herders of cattle and horses, speaking tongues descended from the same distant ancestor that gave rise to the languages of India, and to Greek, and to Latin, and down the long branching centuries to the very English in which I am speaking to you now, so that when a Persian said the word for father, or for mother, or for the shining god of the daytime sky, you could hear, if you listened, the family resemblance to words a world away, cousins separated at the dawn of things. Two of these peoples matter most to our story. One called themselves, in their own tongue, the Aryas, a word meaning something like the noble or the honorable ones, from which the very name of Iran descends, the land of the Aryas. And one branch of them settled in the southwestern highlands, in a region the Elamites had called Anshan, and that would come to be called Parsa, and these were the Persians. And to the north of them, in the western mountains and the lands toward the great old cities of Mesopotamia, settled their close kin, a people the world would come to call the Medes. For a long time it was the Medes, not the Persians, who mattered. It was the Medes who first gathered the scattered highland tribes into something like a kingdom. The Medes who fought the terrible Assyrians whose war machine had terrorized the whole Near East for centuries. And it was the Medes who, in alliance with a resurgent Babylon, finally brought that machine down, joining in the sack of the Assyrian capital of Nineveh, that byword for cruelty, in an event so shattering that the news of it echoes through the Hebrew prophets, one of whom sang over the ruined city a song of savage joy. When the dust of Assyria's fall settled, the Medes stood as one of the great powers of the age, their kings ruling from a highland capital, holding the northern plateau and reaching west into Anatolia, and the Persians of the south in Parsa were their subjects and their kinsmen both, a junior branch of the same family, ruled by their own line of local kings who bowed, when required, to the Median throne. It is a nice historical irony, and the Persians never quite lived it down in the eyes of the Greeks, that the very name by which the outside world often knew them, the Medes, the thing the Greeks meant when they spoke of the great enemy from the east, was in truth the name of the people the Persians had themselves overthrown, so that the Greeks spent a century calling the Persian menace by the name of the Persians' own former masters, a confusion of the conqueror with the conquered that would have amused the Persians, if anyone had ever bothered to explain it to the Greeks, which no one did. Because that, as we will see again and again tonight, was rather the whole problem. The founder of the Persian royal line, the man from whom the dynasty took its name, was called Achaemenes, and he is more a shadow than a man, a name at the head of a genealogy, remembered by his descendants as the fountainhead of the family, the way Egyptian kings remembered a first ruler at the edge of the light. After him came a line of local kings of Parsa, vassals of the Medes, ruling their highland valleys and their herds and their khanats, marrying, we are told, into the Median royal house, so that the blood of the masters ran in the veins of the servants. And it is out of this line, this obscure family of highland vassal kings in the deep southwest of the plateau, that there was born, somewhere around the year we would call 600 BC, or a little before, the child who would change the shape of the world, and around whose birth, as around the birth of every world changer, the later ages wrapped so many marvelous and contradictory stories that the plain truth of it is now beyond our reach. His name was Kurush. The Greeks would call him Cyrus, and the empire begins with him. Let me be honest with you at the outset about how we know what we know of Cyrus, because it matters, and because honesty about our sources is a thread I want to keep in your hand all through this long night. We have almost nothing from Cyrus himself, and what little there is, we will come to. What we have instead is stories, and the stories come mostly from two directions, and both of them have reasons to shape the truth. On one side we have the Greeks, above all a historian named Herodotus, the same restless, curious, endlessly readable Greek traveler we met at the far end of the Egyptian story, who wrote a century after Cyrus lived and gathered his tales from Persian and Median and Greek informants, and who tells the life of Cyrus as a kind of grand folk tale, full of prophetic dreams and exposed infants and cruel kings undone by fate. Wonderful to read and impossible, in most of its particulars, to believe. On the other side, we have the Babylonians and the Hebrews, the peoples Cyrus conquered or liberated, who wrote of him in the language of their own hopes, the Babylonian priests hailing him as the rightful king chosen by their own God to set right the wrongs of a bad ruler. The Hebrew scriptures going further still and calling him, astonishingly, the anointed of the Lord, the shepherd who would fulfill God's purpose, the only foreign Gentile king in the whole Hebrew Bible ever to be given that sacred title, which is a measure of the gratitude of a people he had rescued from exile, and which is also, we should remember, a portrait painted by the grateful. Somewhere behind the Greek folk tale and the liberated people's hymns stands the real man, and the honest position is that we can see his deeds, which were enormous and undeniable, far more clearly than we can ever see his heart. The folk tale, since we should hear it once, runs like this in Herodotus. The last great king of the Medes, Astyages, the grandfather, in this telling, of Cyrus by a daughter married off to a Persian vassal, dreamed a pair of terrible dreams that his priests interpreted to mean that his daughter's son would one day overthrow him and rule in his place. And so, in the way of frightened kings in every old story from every land, he ordered the infant killed, handing the baby to a trusted noble with instructions to do away with him. And the noble, unable to bring himself to murder a child and unwilling to take the guilt upon his own house, passed the baby instead to a herdsman with orders to expose him on a mountainside to die. And the herdsman carried the child home first and found that his own wife had just borne a stillborn son, and the two of them, in their grief and their pity, made the exchange that folk tale demands, laying their own dead child out on the mountain in the royal blankets and raising the living prince as their own, so that Cyrus, the future king of the world, grew up in this story as a herdsman's son among the herders and the herds, on the high slopes, drinking the same snowmelt as our nameless man on his rock. And the truth came out, of course, as it always does in these tales, when the boy, playing king in a children's game in the village, had another child whipped for disobedience, and the whipped boy's father complained to Astyages, who saw in the herder boy's bearing and his face something of his own blood, and questioned the herdsman, and learned the truth. And the wheel of the prophecy began, slowly and terribly, to turn. Now, you will recognize this story, because you have heard it 100 times in 100 costumes: the royal infant condemned, the servant who cannot kill, the substitution, the child raised in obscurity who grows to fulfill the fate his enemies tried to prevent. And the reason you recognize it is that it is one of the oldest and most portable stories humans tell. And it was told of Sargon of Akkad more than 1,000 years before Cyrus, and it would be told of Romulus, and of Moses in the bulrushes, and of others beyond counting. And its appearance in the life of Cyrus is the surest possible sign that we have left history and entered legend, that the Greeks, or the Persians who told the Greeks, reached for the standard shape into which great men are poured, and poured Cyrus into it. So let us set the exposed infant gently aside, the way we set aside the divine births of the pharaohs, not because it is worthless, but because it is a different kind of true, the truth of what people needed the founder to be. And let us hold instead to the bones of it that history can support, which are these. Cyrus was born into the Persian royal line of Parsa, the vassal kings of the south. He was very likely related by marriage to the Median royal house, so that the later story of grandfather and grandson has at least a root in real dynastic fact. And somewhere around the year 550 BC, Cyrus, king of the Persians, rose against his overlord, the king of the Medes, and after a war whose course we can only dimly trace, in which, the sources agree, a portion of the Median army came over to the Persian side rather than fight him, a detail that has the ring of truth and that will echo through his whole career. Cyrus defeated Astyages, took the Median capital, and made himself master of both peoples, the Medes and the Persians together, king of the highland world. And here, at the very first step, we see the thing that made Cyrus different from every conqueror who had come before him. And it is a thing so quiet that it is easy to walk straight past it into the flashier conquests that followed. When Cyrus overthrew the Medes, he did not destroy them. He did not raze their cities or enslave their people or hunt their nobles to extinction, as the Assyrians before him would have done as a matter of course, as a matter of policy, deporting whole nations and flaying their kings and boasting of it on their palace walls. Cyrus took the Median kingdom and folded the Medes into his own new order almost as equals, keeping their nobles in high office, keeping their administrative machinery, keeping, above all, their sense that they were partners in the enterprise and not merely its victims, so that from the very beginning the empire he was building was not a Persian empire in the narrow sense, a machine for one people to squeeze the rest, but something new, a joint enterprise, a partnership of peoples with the Persians first among them, but not alone. The Greeks, tellingly, could never quite keep the two straight, and went on calling the whole thing the Medes as often as the Persians. And in a strange way their confusion was a truer picture than they knew, because Cyrus really had made one people out of two, and he was only getting started. Now the conquests come quickly, and they come, one after another, against the three other great powers that shared the world with the young Highland kingdom, and the pattern that Cyrus set in the folding in of the Medes holds through all of them, so that his whole career reads less like a story of destruction than like a story of gathering. A man walking through a shattered world, picking up the pieces and fitting them together into something none of them had been able to be alone. The first of the great powers to fall was Lydia, away to the west, in the rich rolling country of what is now western Turkey, a kingdom fabulously wealthy on the gold that washed down its rivers, ruled by a king whose name has become, in our own language, a byword for wealth itself. Croesus, rich as Croesus, a man so proud of his treasure that the Greeks told a famous story of how the wise Athenian Solon visited his court, and Croesus showed off all his gold and asked the sage who was the happiest man in the world, expecting to hear his own name, and Solon named instead an ordinary Athenian who had lived a good life and died well in battle for his city, and told the offended king the line the Greeks never tired of repeating, that no man should be called happy until he is dead, because only then is he safe from the turning of fortune's wheel. And the wheel turned for Croesus. Hearing of the rise of this new Persian power on his eastern border, and consulting in the Greek telling the great oracle at Delphi, which gave him the kind of answer oracles specialize in, that if he attacked the Persians he would destroy a great empire. Croesus marched east, never troubling to ask which great empire the god had meant, and the empire he destroyed, of course, was his own. Cyrus met him, chased him back to his mountain fortress capital of Sardis, and took the city and the Lydian kingdom, and all the gold of Croesus, in a single swift campaign, and with it Cyrus inherited the Greek cities of the Aegean coast, the Ionian Greeks, who had been Lydia's subjects and now became Persia's, a small and seemingly unimportant acquisition on the far western edge of his growing realm. A handful of quarrelsome little trading towns full of clever, restless, argumentative people. And if you want to know where the great war that half the world remembers as the defining struggle of the Persian story was first seeded, it was here, in this offhand inheritance, in these small coastal towns that Cyrus picked up almost as an afterthought along with the treasure of Lydia. But that harvest was 2 generations away. For now Croesus was beaten, and here the sources give us one of those moments that may be legend and may be memory, and is in either case worth keeping, because they tell that Cyrus, having taken his enemy, did not kill him, but spared him, and kept him at court, and made the fallen king of Lydia one of his own advisors, so that the wheel that had thrown Croesus down set him, in his fall, beside the man who had conquered him, alive. The second great power was the greatest of all, the oldest, the richest, the most storied city in the world, and its name was Babylon. To understand what it meant for Cyrus to take Babylon, you have to understand that Babylon was to the ancient Near East what Rome would later be to the West, and what Egypt was to itself, the very definition of civilization. An immense and ancient metropolis on the Euphrates, its walls so vast the Greeks could scarcely believe the reports of them, its great tower temple climbing toward heaven, its hanging gardens numbered among the wonders of the world. A city that had been a byword for power and splendor and pride for 2,000 years before Cyrus was born. And Babylon, in Cyrus's day, was ruled by a king named Nabonidus, an odd and unpopular figure, a king who had, for reasons that have puzzled everyone ever since, absented himself from his own capital for years to live in a distant desert oasis, neglecting the great annual festival of the city's chief god Marduk, a festival on which the whole legitimacy of Babylonian kingship was thought to depend, and thereby making bitter enemies of Marduk's powerful priesthood, who came to see their absentee king as a man who had abandoned the god and forfeited the god's favor. And when Cyrus marched on Babylon, in the year 539 BC, the greatest city in the world did not, in the end, resist him. It opened its gates, whether by the treachery of a disaffected faction, or the calculation of the priests who had lost faith in Nabonidus, or simply the good sense of a population that saw which way the wind was blowing. Babylon fell to Cyrus, the sources agree, with almost no fighting at all, the Persian army entering the city in the Babylonian account so smoothly that ordinary life barely paused, the shrines undamaged, the people unharmed, and Cyrus proclaimed not as a foreign conqueror, but as the liberator the true God had sent to punish the bad king and restore the proper order of things. And here we come to the single most remarkable object that survives from the reign of Cyrus, and one of the most remarkable objects to survive from the entire ancient world. A small barrel-shaped cylinder of baked clay, about the size of a large loaf of bread, covered in tidy lines of Babylonian cuneiform, discovered in the 19th century in the ruins of Babylon and now one of the most visited treasures in the British Museum, and known to the world as the Cyrus cylinder. On it, in the traditional formulas of Babylonian royal proclamation, Cyrus, or the priests writing in his name, tells the story of his taking of the city, and it is worth dwelling on what it says, because it has been called, with some exaggeration but not without reason, the first declaration of human rights, and while that is a claim that needs careful handling, the thing itself is genuinely astonishing. Cyrus presents himself not as the destroyer of Babylon, but as its restorer, chosen by Marduk, the city's own god, to end the impiety of Nabonidus and set the world right. He proclaims that he has brought peace to the city, that he has not allowed his troops to terrorize the population, that he has restored the temples and the shrines that had fallen into neglect, and, most striking of all, that he has allowed the peoples whom earlier kings had torn from their homes and deported to their captivity in Babylon to return to their own lands and to rebuild the sanctuaries of their own gods. Now, we should be careful, and the honest historian is careful here, because much of this is the standard boilerplate of Babylonian propaganda, the kind of thing many a king said about himself, and the specific policies are dressed in the flattering language of the priesthood that welcomed him, and the phrase human rights belongs to our world and not to his, and to hang it around the neck of an ancient conqueror is to ask him to be something he never dreamed of being. And yet, when you set the boilerplate aside and look at what Cyrus actually did, across the whole span of his reign and the reigns of his successors, the policy of the cylinder was not empty words. He really did let deported peoples go home. He really did restore local gods to their temples. He really did rule, wherever he could, by confirming and respecting the customs and the cults and the local authorities of the peoples he took over, rather than by grinding them into a single Persian sameness. And the proof of it is written not only on his own cylinder, but in the sacred literature of a people who were not Persian and had no reason to flatter him. Because among the deported nations sitting captive in Babylon when Cyrus took the city was a small community from a small kingdom far to the west. A people who had been carried off from their homeland by the Babylonians a generation before, torn from their capital city and their ruined temple, and marched into exile, and who sat by the rivers of Babylon and wept, in the famous words of their own psalm, when they remembered the home they had lost. And Cyrus let them go home. The Jews, the people of Judah, exiled in Babylon, were permitted by the decree of Cyrus to return to Jerusalem and to rebuild the temple of their God, and their scriptures remember it forever, naming Cyrus the shepherd of the Lord, the anointed one, the foreign king whom God himself had called by name to be the instrument of his people's deliverance. And there is, when you sit with it in the dark, something almost dizzying in the fact that we can read in one of the most influential books ever written, the gratitude of a small conquered people toward the great conqueror who chose, when he could have done anything, to be kind, and that this gratitude has echoed down 25 centuries and shaped the way half the world thinks about mercy and power, all because one Highland king, master now of the greatest city on earth, decided that an empire is stronger when it lets its peoples keep their gods. I do not want to make Cyrus a saint, because he was a conqueror, and conquest is a bloody business, and the peace of the cylinder was the peace of a man who had already won and could afford to be generous. And there were, surely, cities that resisted him and paid for it in the coin such resistance was always paid in, though the record of those is thin, written by no grateful psalmist. But I do want to make you feel how genuinely new his idea of empire was, because everything that came before him in that part of the world, and much that came after, worked on the opposite principle, the principle of the Assyrians, that an empire is a machine for terror, that you hold 100 peoples down by making examples of them, by deportation and massacre and the flaying of kings, by making yourself so frightful that no one dares to rise. And the Assyrians ruled that way for centuries, and built a magnificent and hideous state on it, and were, in the end, so universally hated that when they finally fell, the whole world sang, and no one, in all the ages since, has ever wept for Nineveh. Cyrus looked at that model, the only model of empire the world had, and he did something else. He bet that an empire could be held together not primarily by terror, but by a kind of contract, by leaving people their gods and their customs and their local rulers, by being, from the point of view of the average subject in some far valley, a lighter and fairer and more distant master than the local tyrant he had replaced, by making it, in short, more comfortable to be ruled by Persia than to fight it. And the astonishing thing, the thing that makes this whole long story possible, is that the bet paid off, that Cyrus and his heirs really did hold together for 2 centuries the most diverse collection of peoples ever gathered under one crown, largely by this method, and that when the Greeks, who hated and feared and fought the Persians, sat down to imagine the ideal education of the perfect ruler, one of the greatest of them, the soldier and writer Xenophon, wrote a whole admiring book not about a Greek, but about Cyrus, holding up the Persian founder as the very model of the wise and generous king, which is a little like a modern nation writing its manual of ideal leadership about the founder of its oldest enemy, and which tells you, better than any battle, what kind of shadow this man cast. Cyrus died, as conquerors often do, on campaign at the far edge of his own world, and the manner of his death is lost in the same fog of legend as his birth, the most famous version in Herodotus, having him fall in battle against a fierce nomad people of the northeastern steppe, the Massagetae, ruled by a warrior queen named Tomyris, whose son Cyrus had killed by a trick, and who, in the terrible poetry of the tale, took her revenge by having the dead king's head thrust into a skin filled with human blood, so that the man who had thirsted all his life for conquest might at last drink his fill. It is almost certainly not true, and other sources give him a quieter end. But it is the kind of story people tell about a man who reached too far, a warning folded into a legend, and even the Greeks who told it could not help admiring the queen who defeated the undefeatable king. What is not legend is his tomb, because it still stands, out on the high plain at a place called Pasargadae, the first capital, the place where Cyrus had built his palaces and his gardens, and it is one of the most quietly moving buildings in the world. It is not a pyramid. It is not a mountain of stone raised to crush the sky with the pride of the man beneath it. It is a small, plain, gabled stone house, hardly larger than a cottage, lifted up on a low-stepped platform, standing alone in the wide, empty plain under the enormous sky, simple almost to the point of severity. And inside it, once, lay the body of the man who had conquered the world, in a golden coffin, with, the Greeks say, a simple inscription, whether truly or as a thing men wished he had said, that read something like, "O man, whoever you are and wherever you come from, for I know you will come. I am Cyrus, who won the empire for the Persians. Do not grudge me this little earth that covers my body." 200 years later, when Alexander the Great, having conquered the Persian Empire in his turn, came to Pasargadae and found the tomb of Cyrus broken into and plundered, he is said to have been genuinely grieved and to have ordered it restored and the inscription recut, one world conqueror doing honor to the ghost of another across the gulf of 2 centuries. And there is no better measure of the size of Cyrus than that the man who destroyed everything he built could not bring himself to leave his grave dishonored. The little stone house still stands today. The gold is long gone, and the body, and the inscription. But the house stands, plain and small and alone under the plateau sky. And if you have ever doubted that a man might be great without being cruel, that is where the doubt goes to be quiet. Cyrus left the empire to his son, Cambyses. And here the story darkens, because Cambyses has come down to us as one of the great villains of the ancient world. A mad king, a temple desecrator, a murderer of his own family, the very image of the Eastern despot gone rotten with power. And it is worth pausing on him not because the dark portrait is wholly false, but because the way we came to have it tells us so much about the deepest problem in this whole story, which is that the Persians were written up over and over by the people who hated them most, and we have believed the enemy's version for 2,500 years. The one great thing Cambyses did was finish his father's work by conquering the last of the ancient world's great independent powers, the one Cyrus had never reached. Egypt itself, the oldest civilization on Earth, the very land whose 3,000-year story we spent another long night unwinding. In the year 525 BC, Cambyses led the Persian army across the Sinai, defeated the Egyptian forces at a great battle in the Delta, took the pharaoh captive, and made himself the master of the Nile, so that now, for the first time in history, a single king ruled both the great river civilizations, Mesopotamia and Egypt together, along with Anatolia and the highland world and the coasts between, an empire spanning the entire settled heart of the old world. And the Persian king added to his titles that of pharaoh, and had himself portrayed on Egyptian monuments in the immemorial style, kilted and crowned, offering to the Egyptian gods a Persian ruling the two lands as the 800th heir of Narmer. And the way the Greeks told the story of that conquest, following, they said, what the Egyptian priests told them, was a story of madness and sacrilege, of a king who, once in Egypt, ran wild, who mocked the Egyptian gods, who stabbed the sacred Apis bull, the living god of Memphis, with his own dagger and left it to die, who opened ancient tombs and burned mummies and did every impious and cruel thing a mind could invent. A foreign tyrant defiling the holiest things of the holiest land, driven at last into raving insanity as the god's punishment for his crimes. And here is where we must stop and be careful, because modern archaeology has quietly taken that whole lurid portrait apart. The Egyptian records of the sacred Apis bulls survive. The careful accounts the priests themselves kept of each divine bull's life and death and burial. And they show that the Apis bull that lived during the reign of Cambyses died in its own good time, of old age, and was buried with full and lavish honors in a great stone sarcophagus with an inscription in which Cambyses himself, the supposed bull slayer, appears in proper pharaonic form doing the animal reverence, which is not what one expects to find recorded of a king who is said to have stabbed the creature to death in a fit of impious rage. The story of the murdered bull, in other words, the very centerpiece of the case against Cambyses, appears to be simply false, a slander that grew up after the fact, and once you have caught the tradition in one clear lie, you begin to look at the rest of it differently, and to notice that the men who told it had every reason to blacken him. The Egyptian priesthood had, in fact, real grievances against Cambyses, because a surviving decree shows that he sharply cut the state funding that had flowed to the Egyptian temples under the pharaohs, tightening the purse strings on a rich and privileged priestly establishment in exactly the way a hard-headed new foreign ruler might. And there is no surer way to be remembered as a mad and God-hating monster than to cut the budget of the men who write the histories. And behind the Egyptian priests stood the Greeks, who loathed Persia and were delighted to pass on any tale that showed the great Eastern enemy as a race of cruel and decadent despots. And behind all of it, as we will see in a moment, stood a very specific Persian reason for painting Cambyses black, because the man who took his throne needed him to have been a monster. So the mad Cambyses of legend, like the exposed infant Cyrus, dissolves under examination into something we can no longer clearly see, a real king, no doubt a hard one, perhaps a harsh and unlucky one, who conquered Egypt with real skill and then died, and around whose memory his enemies and his supplanter wove a story so vivid and so damning that it has outlived the truth by 2,500 years. I cannot tell you what Cambyses was really like. No one can. But I can tell you to be careful of a dead king painted entirely in black by the people who profited from his fall, and that caution, once you have it, will serve you well not only in the Persian story, but in every story, ancient and modern, that anyone will ever tell you. For Cambyses did die, suddenly and strangely, in the year 522 BC, while hurrying home from Egypt, and the manner of his death, like everything else about him, comes to us wrapped in a tale of doom, that he accidentally wounded himself in the thigh with his own sword, in the very same part of the body where he was said to have stabbed the sacred bull, so that even his death was made to rhyme with his crime. A wound for a wound, the gods collecting their debt. And he died, the sources agree, without a living son to follow him. And into the sudden emptiness at the top of the greatest empire in the world, there stepped a crisis so strange, so murky, and so consequential that it produced, as its byproduct, one of the most important documents in the whole history of the human race. And it is to that crisis, and that document, and the man who made it, that we now must turn. Because with the death of Cambyses, the clear line of Cyrus runs out, and the throne of the world is seized by a man who spent the rest of his life insisting, on a cliff face, in 3 languages, to the gods and to all posterity, that he had come by it honestly, and whom half of history has suspected, ever since, of protesting too much. Here is what the official story says. The story the new king had carved into the living rock of a mountain for all the ages to read, and here is why almost no one entirely believes it. And here is why it does not finally matter whether we believe it, because the carving itself, the act of carving it, changed the world. When Cambyses died on the road home from Egypt, the official story runs, the throne was seized by an impostor. There had been, it says, a younger brother of Cambyses, a prince named Bardia, or Smerdis as the Greeks called him, and Cambyses, before he ever went to Egypt, had secretly had this brother murdered, telling no one, so that the killing was known only to a tiny handful. And a certain priest, a Magian named Gaumata, learning of the secret death, saw his chance. And because the true Bardia was gone, and unmourned, and unknown to be dead, this Gaumata came forward claiming to be Bardia, the king's brother, risen to take the throne. And because no one knew the prince was dead, the impostor was widely believed, and he seized the empire and ruled it for some months under the dead prince's name, a fraud upon the whole world. And it was against this false Bardia, this impostor priest, that the hero of the story rose, a young Persian nobleman of the royal Achaemenid line, a distant cousin of Cyrus and Cambyses, a man named Darius, whom we call Darius, who saw through the fraud, gathered 6 loyal noble companions, broke into the usurper's stronghold, and killed the impostor with his own hand, and so, having destroyed the lie, took the empty and rightful throne, restoring the kingship to the true line and the world to its proper order. That is the official story, and Darius had it carved in enormous letters, in 3 languages, on the sheer face of a mountain in the western highlands, at a place called Behistun, hundreds of feet up a cliff along the great road, where it could be seen and never reached. A proclamation to the gods and to all future time, and around the great inscription he had carved a relief showing himself, larger than life, 1 foot planted on the prostrate body of the fallen usurper, facing a line of 9 other captured rebel kings roped together at the neck, with the winged symbol of the great god floating above, blessing the whole scene. Now, the trouble with this story is that it is exactly the kind of story a usurper tells. Consider what it accomplishes. Darius was not the son of Cambyses, nor the son of Cyrus, nor in any close way the heir to the throne. He was a nobleman of a collateral branch, and by any ordinary reckoning of succession, when Cambyses died childless, Darius had no obvious right to rule at all. The one man who did have a clear right, if he lived, was Cambyses' own brother, Bardia. And it is a remarkable convenience, is it not, that in Darius's telling that brother turns out to have been secretly dead all along, killed years earlier by Cambyses himself in a murder so secret that no one had noticed the prince was gone, so that the man everyone thought was Bardia, the man actually sitting on the throne when Darius killed him, was not the real prince at all, but a look-alike impostor, meaning that when Darius drove his dagger into that man, he was not killing the rightful king, but merely unmasking a fraud. And the throne he then took was not stolen from anyone, because the person it belonged to had conveniently been dead for years. You do not have to be a cynic to notice that this is precisely the story a man would invent if the plain truth were that he had murdered the legitimate king, the real Bardia, the actual brother of Cambyses, and seized the empire by main force, and needed, desperately, to make that killing look not like the crime it was, but like the righteous destruction of an impostor. And many historians, ancient and modern, have suspected exactly that there was no impostor, that the man Darius killed was the true Bardia, the rightful heir, and that the whole elaborate tale of the secret murder and the look-alike priest was the greatest cover story in the ancient world, carved onto a cliff in letters tall enough to be believed. I cannot tell you the truth of it, and neither can anyone else, because the only detailed account we have of the whole affair is Darius's own, the version of the man with everything to gain. And the Greek stories that follow all descend, in the end, from Persian court traditions shaped by the winners. Perhaps there really was an impostor. Such things have happened, and a great empire in the shock of a childless king's sudden death is exactly the kind of place a bold fraud might briefly succeed. Or perhaps Darius was simply a usurper of genius who killed the true king and then, with breathtaking nerve, carved his lie so high on a mountain and repeated it so insistently in so many languages that it hardened over the centuries into history. What is certain, what no one disputes, is that when Darius took the throne, the whole empire that Cyrus had built erupted in revolt, province after province rising against the new king, Babylon rebelling, the Medes rebelling, Elam, Egypt, the eastern lands. Rebellion after rebellion breaking out across the enormous realm in the single year after Cambyses died, and Darius spent that year and more marching and fighting the length and breadth of the empire, winning, by his own count, 19 battles, capturing 9 rebel kings, drowning the risings in blood, and reassembling by sheer relentless force the empire that had flown apart at the moment of succession. And this frenzy of revolt is itself, perhaps, the best evidence that the succession was not the clean and rightful thing the official story claims, because empires do not shatter into a dozen simultaneous rebellions over the peaceful accession of an undoubted heir. Something had broken. Whatever the truth of Bardia, the taking of the throne by Darius was violent, contested, and drenched in the blood of the whole empire's resistance. And out of that year of fire, Darius emerged the undisputed master, and the empire, once he had it, he held and reshaped and ruled for 36 years, and made, in the end, more thoroughly his own than Cyrus, its founder, ever had. But I promised you that the cliff mattered more than the crime. And here is why, and it is one of my favorite things in all of history. One of those places where the deep past reaches forward across the centuries and hands the future a gift it did not know it was giving. Darius had his great proclamation carved at Behistun in 3 languages, because his was an empire of many peoples, and the message needed to be readable by the powerful nations under his rule. In Old Persian, the language of the ruling house; in Elamite, the old administrative tongue of the southwest; and in Babylonian, the language of Mesopotamia and of learning, all 3 written in the wedge-shaped cuneiform script that had been the writing of the Near East for 3,000 years. And by the time the modern world came to look at that cliff, in the 19th century of our own era, that entire family of scripts was dead, unreadable, as lost as the hieroglyphs of Egypt had been before the Rosetta Stone. Thousands of clay tablets and stone inscriptions all across the ruins of Mesopotamia and Persia, covered in the neat wedges of cuneiform that no living person could read. The whole written memory of the oldest civilizations on Earth, locked shut. And the Behistun inscription, that vast trilingual proclamation of Darius carved to justify a possibly stolen throne, turned out to be the key that opened it. The Rosetta Stone of the cuneiform world. 3 versions of the same long text in 3 related but distinct writing systems, one of which, the Old Persian, was simpler than the others and could be cracked first and then used as a lever to pry open the rest, so that a self-justifying royal lie carved into a mountainside to fool the ancients became, 24 centuries later, the instrument that let the moderns read the entire lost literature of ancient Mesopotamia, the laws of Hammurabi, the Epic of Gilgamesh, the libraries of the Assyrian kings, the daily tablets of Babylon, all of it recovered because Darius needed the whole empire to believe him, and so wrote his story 3 times on a cliff. But the recovery of it was not a matter of scholars reading comfortably from photographs, and this is the part I cannot resist, because the inscription hangs on a sheer cliff more than 300 feet up, deliberately placed beyond reach so that no later hand could deface it. And the man who first copied it in full, an Englishman named Henry Rawlinson in the 1830s and 40s, had to do it by climbing the cliff again and again, and standing on the narrow ledges and hanging from ropes and, for the highest and least reachable Babylonian portion, employing, the story goes, a local boy small and fearless enough to swarm up the last impossible stretch of bare rock and take a paper squeeze of the signs where no grown man could go, so that the key to the whole written memory of the ancient Near East was brought down off the mountain, in the last of it, in the hands of an anonymous climbing boy whose name, in the perfect and maddening symmetry of this entire story, was of course never written down. Darius carved his version of the truth beyond the reach of men so that it could never be altered. And it could never be altered. And it sat there, exactly as he left it, for 2,400 years, until men climbed up and copied it and used it to resurrect 100 lost voices that Darius never meant to save. And if there is a better parable of how the past actually reaches us, sideways, by accident, through the self-serving monuments of the powerful put to uses they never imagined, I have not found it, and I offer it to you here, in the deep part of the night, as one of the small, strange consolations of history, that even a lie, if it is carved high enough and left alone long enough, can end up telling the truth. Cyrus won the empire. Darius, whatever the manner of his coming to power, was the one who made it work, and it is here, in the long 36-year reign of Darius, that the Persian Empire stops being a series of brilliant conquests and becomes a machine, a functioning, durable, administered state on a scale the world had never seen and would not see again for a very long time. And I want to spend real time in the workings of that machine, because the battles are what everyone remembers, and the machine is what actually mattered. The quiet, unglamorous, superbly designed apparatus by which one king could govern half the human race across 3,000 miles. And because, if you are drifting toward sleep, there are few things more soothing than the contemplation of a great system working smoothly, the water running down its buried channels, everything in its place. The central problem Darius faced was the problem of size. His empire was simply too vast to be ruled the way older, smaller kingdoms had been ruled, by a king who could personally know his whole realm. From the Aegean coast to the Indus was a journey of months. A rebellion on one frontier might be over, won or lost, before word of its beginning reached the capital. A governor at the far edge of the world, months from any check on his behavior, might as well be a king himself. And the older empires that had tried to hold territory on anything like this scale, above all the Assyrians, had done it, as we have seen, by terror, by making the cost of disobedience so hideous that no one dared. And Darius, following Cyrus, chose a different and more durable path. The path of system, and the system he built, or perfected, was the satrapy. He divided the whole empire into a set of great provinces, some 20 of them, each called a satrapy, and over each he set a governor called a satrap, a word that meant, in the Persian tongue, something like protector of the realm, usually a Persian nobleman, sometimes a trusted local, who ruled his province as a kind of viceroy, a small king under the great king, collecting the taxes, administering the justice, keeping the peace, maintaining the roads, a figure of real and considerable power. And the danger of such a system is obvious. The danger that these powerful provincial viceroys, so far from the center, would become independent, would rebel, would carve the empire back up into the pieces Cyrus had gathered. And Darius guarded against that danger with a set of checks so elegant that they have been imitated, knowingly or not, by administrators ever since. For alongside each satrap, in each province, Darius placed a separate military commander, in charge of the royal garrison troops, who did not answer to the satrap but reported directly and independently to the king, so that the man who governed the province and the man who commanded its soldiers were two different men watching each other, neither able to rebel without the other, a division of power that made treason require conspiracy and conspiracy require trust and trust among ambitious men so watched, hard to come by. And alongside both of them, Darius placed a third figure, a royal secretary, a scribe of the king, who kept the records and the correspondence, and reported, again, directly to the center. And over all of them, watching everyone, moving through the provinces on the king's own business, went the royal inspectors, officials whom the Greeks, with a shiver, called the eyes and ears of the king, traveling agents who arrived without warning to examine the satrap's accounts and the state of the province and the loyalty of its officials, and to carry what they found straight back to the throne, so that no governor, however distant, could ever be quite sure that the merchant at his table or the traveler in his hall was not, in truth, the eye of the king, sent to see how he ruled. It was, in its way, a system built on a very Persian insight, the same insight that had built the Khanate, that great things are held together not by a single dramatic force, but by many patient, overlapping, quietly maintained mechanisms, each checking the others, the whole invisible architecture keeping the precious thing from leaking away into the waste. And it worked. For 200 years, with lapses and rebellions and terrible crises, it fundamentally worked, and half the world was held together by it. And the deepest proof of how well it was designed is that when Alexander finally conquered the empire, he did not tear the system down. He kept it. He took over the satrapies more or less intact, ruling his own vast conquest through the very machine Darius had built. And so did the kingdoms that came after Alexander. And so, in ways that run down through the Romans and beyond, did much of the administrative world that followed. So that the shape of provincial government across a great deal of later history is, at bottom, the shape Darius drew. The great province and the appointed governor and the separated soldier and the traveling inspector. The quiet Persian answer to the oldest problem of empire, which is how to hold what you cannot personally see. To make the system run, Darius needed two more things, and he built them both, and they are among the most consequential public works of the ancient world. The first was money, real money, coined money, because you cannot easily run a vast tax-collecting, soldier-paying, road-building state on barter and payments in kind alone. And Darius established a proper imperial coinage, a gold coin so reliable and so widely trusted that it took his own name, the Daric, stamped with the image of the king himself as an archer, kneeling with his bow, and this royal coinage, guaranteed by the great king, circulating across the whole enormous realm, oiled the wheels of the empire's economy, and made possible the collection of a regular, assessed, predictable tribute from every province, each satrapy owing its fixed annual weight of silver or gold or, in the case of some, particular local treasures, so that Herodotus could give us an actual list, province by province, of what each corner of the world sent yearly to the king. The Babylonians so much silver, the Indians their tribute in gold dust, the Egyptians their grain and their revenue, the whole immense income of half the human species flowing in assessed and orderly streams toward the center, and the very orderliness of it, the fact that a subject in a far valley knew more or less what he owed and when, was itself a kind of mercy compared to the arbitrary plunder of older conquerors. A predictability that our nameless herder, watching his water come down, might have counted, without ever saying so, among the small blessings of being ruled by a system rather than by a whim. And the second thing Darius built to make the machine run was the road, and I have been promising you the road since the very beginning of the night, so let me give it to you now, because it is one of the true wonders of the ancient world, and it almost never makes the lists. The royal road ran from the western capital of Susa in the old Elamite lowlands, all the way to Sardis, the former Lydian capital near the Aegean coast, a distance of some 1,500 miles, and it was not merely a track, but an engineered, maintained, garrisoned imperial highway. And along its whole length, Darius established a system of posting stations, set roughly a day's ride apart, more than 100 of them, each stocked with fresh horses and provisions and lodging, so that a royal messenger could ride into a station on a spent horse and leap onto a fresh one and ride on, and the next messenger take up the message at the next station in a relay that never stopped, day or night. And by this system, a message could travel the entire 1,500 miles from the coast to the capital inn. The ancient sources tell us, a matter of days, perhaps as few as 7, a speed of communication that would not be reliably beaten anywhere in the world until the coming of the electric telegraph more than 2,000 years later. Think about that for a moment. In the drowsy dark. For the whole of human history, from Darius until almost the age of your own great-great-grandparents, no message could move across land faster than the Persian royal post moved it in the 5th century before Christ. And the reason was not that later ages lacked horses, but that they lacked, until Rome copied it, the system, the patient chain of maintained stations and fresh mounts and organized relays that turned the raw speed of a single galloping horse into the sustained speed of an empire's nervous system. And Herodotus, who could not help admiring even the enemy he feared, watched the Persian couriers at their work and wrote of them a sentence so fine that it has outlived its own occasion by 2,500 years and been carved, of all places, on the front of a great post office in the modern world, that neither snow nor rain nor heat nor gloom of night stays these couriers from the swift completion of their appointed rounds, a line written in praise of the messengers of Darius that a distant nation would one day adopt, without quite knowing it, as the motto of its own mail, so that the ghost of the Persian royal road runs, unnoticed, through the daily life of people who have never heard of Susa. The road carried the messengers, and the road carried the armies, and the road carried the trade, the goods and the ideas and the languages moving up and down its length, and the road carried above all the thing an empire most needs and most lacks, which is knowledge of itself, the king's knowledge of his own distant provinces and their knowledge of him, so that the whole vast body, from the Aegean to the mountains, was strung together on this single artery of packed earth and posting stations, and the blood of information ran through it, and the empire, because of it, could feel its own extremities and act as one. Every great empire builds itself a stage, a single place where the whole idea of it is made visible in stone, where the abstract fact of dominion is turned into something a visitor can walk through and feel in his body. And the Egyptians built Karnak, and the Romans built their Forum, and the Persians built Persepolis. And of all the wonders Darius made, this is the one that survives most gloriously, a ruined ceremonial capital high on the plateau in the Persian homeland. And I want to walk you through it slowly, in the way you might walk through it half dreaming, because Persepolis is not just a beautiful ruin. It is an argument in stone, a whole theory of what the empire was, carved on every wall. And once you can read it, the stones begin to speak. Darius chose the site and began the work, and his son Xerxes and his grandson continued it, so that Persepolis was the labor of generations, a vast artificial terrace, hundreds of yards on a side, raised against the flank of a mountain in a high plain. And on that terrace they built a complex of palaces and halls and gateways, all in a distinctive Persian style that was itself a kind of imperial statement, because it borrowed, deliberately and openly, from every great tradition the empire contained, the fluted columns and refined stonework owing something to the Greeks and Egyptians. The great winged human-headed bulls guarding the gateways descended from the guardian figures of Assyria and Babylon. The whole a magnificent assembled thing, no single people's style, but a chorus of them. The architecture itself proclaiming that this was the empire of all the nations, that every tradition flowed up onto this terrace and was gathered into one. And there is a surviving inscription from Susa, another of Darius's palaces, in which the king lists, with evident pride, exactly where everything came from: the cedar from Lebanon, the gold from Sardis and Bactria, the lapis and carnelian from Sogdiana, the turquoise from Khwarezm, the silver and ebony from Egypt, the ivory from Nubia and India, the stoneworkers who were Ionians and Sardians, the goldsmiths who were Medes and Egyptians, the whole world's materials shaped by the whole world's craftsmen into a single royal house. And the inscription reads, less like a builder's boast than like a hymn to the idea of the empire itself. The notion that its glory lay precisely in its gathering, in the way it drew the far corners of the earth together into one made thing. But the greatest argument at Persepolis is carved on the stairways, and it is the reason the place moves me more than almost any ruin in the world. The grand approach to the main audience hall, the great columned chamber called the Apadana, where the king received his empire, was reached by a monumental staircase, and along the face of that staircase, in a long carved procession that unrolls before you as you climb, march the peoples of the empire, delegation after delegation, 23 of them, each bringing tribute to the king. And the astonishing thing, the thing that stops visitors in their tracks even now among the broken columns, is the tenderness and the specificity and the dignity with which each nation is shown. Here come the Medes in their rounded caps, and the Elamites leading a lioness and her cubs, and the Babylonians with a humped bull, and the Lydians with their fine vessels, and the Egyptians, and the Arabians with their camel, and the Indians with their gold and their donkey, and the distant Scythians of the steppe with their pointed hats and their trousers and their horse, and the Nubians from beyond Egypt bringing ivory and an okapi or a giraffe, each people rendered in its own dress and its own gifts, each carved by the same masterful hands with the same care. And here is the detail that undoes people, that between the delegations, at the head of each, walks a Persian or a Median usher, a court official, and he is shown holding the hand of the leader of the foreign delegation, gently, leading them forward or laying a hand on their shoulder. A small human gesture of courtesy and welcome repeated all up the great stair, so that the entire monumental procession of the world's subject peoples is presented not as a train of the beaten and the humiliated, but as a gathering of honored guests, brought forward hand in hand to bring their gifts to the king who protects them all. Now, we should not be naive. This is the empire's own picture of itself. The propaganda of the powerful and the reality of Persian rule surely fell short of this serene vision of willing nations lovingly gathered, as every empire's reality falls short of its self-portrait. And there were surely peoples on that staircase who had been dragged into the fold in blood, and who paid their tribute in resentment. But consider, even so, what a remarkable thing it is that this is the picture the Persians chose to carve. That when the greatest empire the world had yet seen sat down to represent its own dominion in the most permanent and public way it could, on the very stairway up which the whole apparatus of state processed, it chose to show not a heap of slain enemies, not a king trampling the necks of the conquered, not the flayed captives and the burning cities that the Assyrians had gloried in carving on their walls, but a courteous procession of the world's peoples in their own dress, each keeping its own dignity, each led gently forward by the hand. And that difference, the difference between the wall of Assyria that boasts of terror and the stairway of Persia that dreams of a family of nations, is the whole difference between the two ideas of empire that this story is about. And it is carved still in the stone, up the great stair of Persepolis, waiting for anyone who climbs it to read. The clay tablets found at Persepolis tell a story that fits the stairway better than the Greek slanders would lead you to expect. And I have to tell you about the tablets, because they are the antidote to the whole legend of the effete and cruel Oriental despotism, the corrective that comes not from any king's boastful inscription, but from the empire's own filing cabinets. When the ceremonial terrace was excavated in the 20th century, the diggers found, in the ruins of the fortification and the treasury, tens of thousands of small clay tablets, the administrative paperwork of the running of the place, the receipts and ration records and work orders of the great estate, written mostly in Elamite, and these dry little documents, the least glamorous objects imaginable, turn out to be one of the most humane windows the ancient world ever left us. They record the rations paid out to the vast workforce that built and maintained Persepolis, and what they show is that the labor was not, in the main, the labor of slaves driven under the whip, the groaning multitude of the Persepolis of legend, but paid workers of many nations receiving regular measured wages in grain and wine and beer and livestock, wages carefully recorded and accounted, and the tablets show something more. Something that reaches across the 25 centuries and takes you by the throat, which is that among these paid workers were women, and that the women received rations in their own names, recorded individually, and that women who had recently given birth received extra rations, a bonus of wine or grain for a new mother, and that the ration for the birth of a son and the ration for the birth of a daughter were, in the records, sometimes recorded differently, but that both were paid. Both mothers provided for, the new life on either side acknowledged in the accounts of the king. There is a whole vanished world in those tablets, a world of working women drawing their measured wages of barley and wine at the greatest construction site of the age, of new mothers getting their bonus, of foremen and their crews of many nations paid and fed and recorded. And it is a world so unlike the fevered Greek dream of Persia, all silken tyrants and cringing slaves and unspeakable luxury, that reading the tablets is like having a door opened onto the real thing behind the caricature, the actual, functioning, surprisingly decent administrative machine that the caricature was invented to hide. And I would ask you to keep those working women and their birth rations in mind through everything that follows. Because when we come, as we now must, to the great war between Persia and the Greeks, and to the story the Greeks told about it and about themselves, the tablets of Persepolis are the quiet ledger against which that whole glorious, distorting, incomparable story has to be read. Let us step away from the kings and the cliffs for a while, because an empire is not its kings, and one of the quiet pleasures of this subject is how much we can actually reconstruct of the daily texture of Persian life, partly from those dry Persepolis tablets, partly from the Greeks who lived at the Persian court and could not stop marveling at what they saw, and partly from the long survival of Persian customs down the centuries into a present we can still touch. And the first thing to say, the thing the Greeks said first and loudest and most enviously, is that the Persians knew how to live, that they had raised the ordinary business of eating and drinking and being comfortable to a kind of art, and that the harder, plainer Greeks looked at Persian abundance with a mixture of scorn and longing that they never quite managed to disentangle. The Persians, the Greeks reported, were the greatest lovers of good things in the world, and above all they loved a feast, and the feast of the great king was a thing of legend. Thousands fed daily from the royal kitchens, the tables heaped with every delicacy the empire could send, and the Greeks, whose own diet ran to barley porridge and olives and the occasional fish, told with round eyes of the Persian love of dessert, of the many courses set on after the meat, the sweetmeats and the fruits and the cakes brought on in a long procession, and they told that the Persians mocked the Greeks in turn for their meager eating, saying that the Greeks rose from the table still hungry because nothing worth mentioning was ever set before them after the main dishes, and there is something delicious, if you will forgive it, in this ancient argument across the table, the lean Greeks calling the Persians soft and decadent for enjoying their pudding, the comfortable Persians calling the Greeks half-starved barbarians who did not know how to finish a meal, and both of them, across the whole width of the ancient world, quarreling about dessert. And the Persians loved wine, and here the Greeks recorded a custom so characteristic that I have to give it to you, because it tells you something true about the whole Persian way of governing themselves and their world. It was the Persian habit, Herodotus says, when they had an important decision to make, to debate it twice, once sober and once drunk, and the two verdicts had to agree before the thing was decided, so that a plan resolved upon over the wine was reconsidered in the cold light of the next morning's sobriety, and a plan resolved upon sober was tested against the loosened, warmer, less cautious judgment of men in their cups, and only what survived both moods, the daring of the wine and the prudence of the dawn, was acted upon, and whether or not they truly did it in just that form. The custom is a kind of parable of the Persian genius, the same genius that built the Khanate and the satrapy, the instinct to check one thing against another, to trust no single view, to arrive at truth by the balance of opposites. And I find, the more I sit with it, that I would not mind living under a government that was required to approve its laws once drunk and once sober, and to proceed only on what both the wine and the morning could agree. The Persians dressed for comfort and for color, in the flowing trousers and the sleeved coats and the soft caps that the settled peoples of the south, the Greeks and the Egyptians in their draped linen, found faintly ridiculous and secretly practical, because the Persian clothing was the clothing of a people who had come off the cold, high plateau and the horse, made for riding and for weather, and the Persians, unlike the Greeks who admired the naked athletic body and stripped to exercise and compete, kept themselves covered, thought public nakedness shameful, and the Greeks noted this too as one more sign of the strange modesty and formality of the Eastern people, not understanding that they were looking at the difference between a warm, sunny land of city squares and a high, cold land of mountain winds. The clothing telling, as clothing always does, the story of the ground it grew on. And the Persians loved horses above almost everything, prized them, bred them, sacrificed them to the sun and the education of a young Persian nobleman, the Greeks reported with grudging approval, was summed up in three things and no more: that a boy of the Persian aristocracy was taught from childhood to ride a horse, to draw a bow, and to tell the truth. And there it is again, our thread. The truth woven right into the raising of children, set beside the horse and the bow as one of the three pillars of what it meant to be a proper Persian man, to ride well, to shoot straight, and never to lie. And the Greeks, who valued cleverness in argument and admired a well-turned deception, found this Persian horror of the lie both admirable and a little simple, not seeing that for a people whose whole religion was the war of the truth against the lie, to teach a child not to lie was not a rule of etiquette, but the first lesson of the cosmos. The child enlisted, with his first words, on the side of the light. And underneath the great feasts of the king lay the ordinary meals of the ordinary people, the flat bread and the dates and the curds, the barley and the wine, the diet of the plateau villages that changed little from the herder's table to the townsman's. And the Persepolis tablets let us watch the empire feeding its workers, the measured rations of grain and wine and beer and meat going out day by day to the crews who built and served the great terrace. And it is worth remembering, when we picture the glittering king at his endless feast, that the same records that show us his abundance show us also the careful, decent, accounted provision made for the least of his workers, the rations set down and paid, the new mother's bonus, the whole vast household of the empire fed by system rather than by whim, and that this, the daily bread of the nameless many, was the real foundation on which the golden feast of the one was spread, and that our herder on his rock, watching the water come down to keep his barley alive, was, in the end, the man who fed the King of Kings. The Greeks told the story of the Persian court as a story of women and eunuchs scheming in the shadows behind weak kings. And like all their stories about Persia, it is a distortion, a caricature drawn to make the Eastern monarchy look decadent and unmanly beside the citizen democracies of Greece, where, they like to think, free men governed themselves in the open light of the assembly and women kept properly to the house. And the caricature has done its work so well that the real women of the Persian Empire, who were formidable and consequential and far more visible than the sheltered women of Athens, have come down to us bent almost beyond recognition into the shape of the scheming Oriental queen. So let me straighten them as far as I can, because they deserve it, and because the truth is more interesting than the slander. The women of the Persian royal house held real power and real property. And here again the dry tablets correct the lurid stories, because the accounts show us royal women, the king's mother and the king's wives and the king's daughters, holding great estates in their own names, commanding their own workshops and their own labor forces, receiving and dispersing their own revenues, traveling with their own retinues, sealing their own orders with their own seals, women of business and property and administrative weight, not the veiled prisoners of the harem legend, but landowners and managers on a great scale, and the greatest of them wielded influence at the very summit of the empire, because the mother of the king and the chief wife of the king stood closest of all to the one man who ruled the world, and their word in his ear was a power that the ambitious and the desperate alike sought out. And to call that scheming, as the Greeks did, is only to notice that people close to power use their closeness, which is true in every court in every age, and which the Greeks would have called statesmanship in a man. One woman above all rises out of the record, and her name was Atossa, and she was, in her single person, a kind of living spine of the whole Achaemenid line, because she was the daughter of Cyrus the Great himself, the founder, and she was married in turn, as the dynasty's fortunes twisted, to her own brother Cambyses, and then, briefly, to the shadowy Bardia, the true or false prince, and then to Darius, so that when Darius, the man from the collateral branch whose right to the throne was so questionable, took Atossa as his wife, he was marrying the blood of Cyrus itself, tying his own uncertain claim to the founder's line through the founder's daughter. And it was the son of Darius and Atossa, the grandson of Cyrus through his mother, who inherited the throne, and his name was Xerxes, so that the great king who wept on the hilltop and marched against Greece was the grandson of Cyrus the Great through this remarkable woman. And Herodotus tells us, in a scene we cannot fully trust but should not fully dismiss, that it was Atossa herself, in the intimacy of the royal bedchamber, who first turned her husband Darius toward the conquest of Greece, urging the campaign for reasons of her own, so that the whole vast war that the world remembers in the Greek telling may have had at its root, as the Greeks themselves half believed, the will of the daughter of Cyrus working through the men she had married and mothered. And whether or not it is literally true, the fact that the Greeks could imagine the great war beginning in the words of a Persian queen tells you that they knew, however much they mocked, that the women of that court were powers to reckon with. And the ordinary women of the empire, the working women of the tablets we have already met, drawing their wages of wine and grain in their own names, receiving their bonus at the birth of a child, laboring in the workshops and the fields alongside the men and paid for it and recorded for it. These women, too, give the lie to the Greek picture of a whole civilization of cloistered captives, because a society that pays its women workers by name and gives new mothers a ration for the child is not the harem of the legend, whatever the great king's private household may or may not have been. And the truth, as usual, is that the Persian world contained both, the secluded splendor of the royal women at the peak and the ordinary laboring visibility of the working women at the base, and that neither one fits the flat caricature the enemy drew, and that the women of Persia, from the daughter of Cyrus, who may have launched a war to the nameless mother collecting her bonus of wine, were, like the men beside them, more real and more capable and more fully alive than the story that erased them ever allowed. Before we ride west to the war, we should pause and ask what the Persians believed, because underneath all the administration and the stone there was a faith, and it was a faith unlike any that had come before it in that part of the world. A faith that may well be, though the dating is fiercely argued, the oldest of the great prophetic religions, the deep root from which a surprising amount of what later peoples believed would grow, and it gives us the through line of this whole night, the thread I asked you to keep in your hand, the great Persian idea of the truth and the lie. Somewhere on the Iranian plateau or the lands just beyond it, at a date that scholars place anywhere from 1,000 to more than 1,700 years before Darius, and about which the honest answer is simply that no one knows, there lived a priest and prophet whose name comes down to us through the Greeks as Zoroaster, and in his own tradition as Zarathustra, And he did something that, so far as we can tell, no one in his world had done before. He took the old religion of his people, the inherited paganism of the Indo-Iranian herders, with its many gods and its blood sacrifices and its ancient rituals, and he reformed it around a single great vision, a vision of the whole universe as the battleground of a cosmic struggle between two opposed principles. And this, if the early dating is right, may be the first time in human history that anyone framed existence in quite this way, as a war between good and evil running through the very structure of the cosmos, and the shadow of that vision is very long. On one side stood the great god whom Zoroaster proclaimed as the one supreme creator, the wise lord, Ahura Mazda, the source of light and life and order, and, above all, of truth, and gathered around him the powers of goodness. And against him stood the principle of the lie, of the destructive spirit, of darkness and disorder and deceit and death, and between these two, the truth and the lie, Asha and Druj. The whole of creation was the contested ground, and every single human being, by every choice, every day, was a soldier in that war, ranged on one side or the other, for the truth or for the lie, and would be judged at last on which side they had fought. And this is the astonishing heart of it, the thing that makes Zoroaster's vision feel so startlingly familiar and so far ahead of its time, that the religion placed at its very center not sacrifice, not ritual purity, not the appeasement of dangerous gods, but ethics, moral choice, the conduct of an ordinary human life, summed up in a threefold formula so simple and so deep that it became the whole watchword of the faith. Good thoughts, good words, good deeds, that a person served the great God and fought on the side of the truth not primarily by any right, but by thinking well and speaking truthfully and acting justly in the daily texture of an ordinary life. And that on this, on the moral weight of a life, everything would finally turn. For Zoroaster taught, and here the resemblances multiply until they are almost vertiginous, that each soul after death would face a judgment and would come to a bridge, the bridge of the separator, which would be wide and easy for the righteous to cross into the house of song, the abode of light and joy in the wise Lord, and would narrow to the edge of a blade for the wicked, who would fall from it into the house of the lie, the abode of darkness and torment. And he taught further that history itself was moving toward a final resolution, a last great battle in which the truth would triumph and the lie be destroyed forever, a renewal of the world, a raising of the dead, and a life everlasting in a creation made perfect at the last. And if, hearing all this, you are hearing echoes of things you thought you knew from elsewhere, the cosmic war of good and evil, the moral judgment of the individual soul, the bridge to heaven or the fall to hell, the last battle and the resurrection and the world made new, you are not mistaken, because a great many scholars believe, though, as always, the matter is argued, that these Persian ideas, carried through the centuries and encountered by the peoples of the Near East during the long Persian rule and after, seeped into and shaped the developing traditions of Judaism and through it of Christianity and of Islam, so that concepts we think of as belonging to those later faiths may have their deepest root here, on the plateau, in the vision of an ancient Iranian prophet whose very dates we cannot fix, and that when a modern believer of one of the world's great religions speaks of the struggle of good against evil, or of the judgment of the soul, or of the final triumph and the world remade, they may be speaking without knowing it, in the distant descended language of Zarathustra, the herder prophet of the truth. Fire was the great symbol of this faith, not because the Persians worshipped fire, as the Greeks lazily said, and many have repeated since, but because fire was the purest visible sign of the wise Lord, of light and warmth and order and the divine presence. And so the fire was tended, kept always burning, in the temples and the sacred places, never to be polluted, never to be let die, a living emblem of the truth kept alight against the dark. And to this day, in the small surviving communities of Zoroastrians in Iran and in India, where the faith fled and endured after the coming of Islam. The sacred fires still burn. Some of them, it is claimed, tended without ceasing for many centuries, a thread of flame reaching back across the whole of this story and beyond it, into the deep morning of the plateau. And it is one of the quiet marvels of the world that the oldest of the great prophetic faiths, the one that may have taught all the others to see the cosmos as a struggle of light against dark, is not dead, that its fires still burn, small and faithful, in a scattered and dwindling few, the last soldiers of the truth still keeping the flame. Now I have been careful all night, and I will be careful here, because the relationship between the kings of our story and the faith of Zoroaster is genuinely uncertain, and the honest historian does not pretend otherwise. Whether Cyrus was a Zoroastrian in any strict sense, we do not know. His religious language on the cylinder is Babylonian, addressed to Marduk. But when we come to Darius and to his great inscription on the cliff at Behistun, the vision of Zoroaster is suddenly, unmistakably present, because Darius, justifying his seizure of the throne, frames the whole thing again and again in exactly the language of the truth and the lie. He proclaims that Ahura Mazda, the wise lord, gave him the kingship. He denounces the man he overthrew and all the rebels who rose against him as followers of the lie, the Drauga, liar kings who led the provinces astray with falsehood, and he presents his own victory as the victory of the truth over the lie, the restoration of the right order that the wise Lord desires. And at the end of the great inscription, Darius turns and addresses the future directly, and warns whoever shall read his words in the ages to come to protect themselves against the lie, to be an enemy of the lie, and prays that Ahura Mazda will be a friend to the man who is a friend of the truth and an enemy to the man who is a friend of the lie. And there is something in that, in a king pausing in the middle of his own monument of self-justification to preach to all future readers the doctrine of the truth against the lie. That is either the sincerest expression of a genuine faith or the most cynical possible deployment of it. And here, at least, the ambiguity is almost too perfect to bear. Because if the suspicious historians are right, if Darius really did kill the true prince and invent the impostor and steal the throne, then the man carving the great sermon against the lie into the everlasting rock, the man calling down the wise Lord's curse on all liars and warning posterity to shun falsehood forever, was himself, in the very act of carving it, telling the greatest lie of his age. And I cannot resolve that for you, and I do not think anyone ever will, but I ask you to hold it, the truth and the lie tangled together at the very foundation of the empire, the king who ruled in the name of the truth, and who may have come to his rule by the deepest of lies, because that inability finally to separate the two, is the most Persian thing in this whole story, and it will not come untied. Since we are riding now toward the Great War, it is the natural moment to ask what the Persian army actually was, because you have a picture of it in your head already, the horde, the numberless faceless multitude driven forward under the whip. And that picture is the Greek picture, and it is wrong, and the reality was both more ordinary and more interesting than the legend of the servile swarm. At the heart of the royal army stood a body of professional infantry that the Greeks called, in a phrase that has echoed ever since, the Immortals, 10,000 elite foot soldiers of the king, and the name, which sounds like a boast of invincibility, was in fact, the Greeks explained, something more precise and more clever than that, because the corps was kept always at exactly 10,000 men, never one more and never one fewer, so that the instant a single immortal fell in battle or died of sickness or grew too old to serve, a man already chosen and waiting stepped at once into his place, and the number was restored. The body of 10,000 thus never diminishing, never being seen to shrink, always 10,000 strong on the field no matter how many individual men within it lived or died, so that the corps as a corps seemed to die never, to be immortal not in the persons of its soldiers, who fell like all men, but in its unbroken and unchanging wholeness, the number itself the thing that could not be killed, and there is something almost philosophical in it. This idea of an immortality that belongs not to any man, but to the pattern the men fill, the individual soldiers mortal and replaceable, and the shape they made undying. And I have always thought it one of the most quietly profound military ideas the ancient world produced. The 10,000 who could not be reduced because the moment one fell, the gap was already filled. The losses invisible, the whole eternal. These were no ragged conscripts. They were the finest soldiers of the empire, splendidly equipped. The Greeks describing the gold that gleamed on them, their spears tipped at the butt with silver or gold pomegranates and apples that marked the ranks. A core of such magnificence that even the enemies who fought them remembered the shine of them. The 10,000 immortal spearmen of the king. The hard, bright core around which the great army was built. But the true strength and the true genius of the Persian army was not the infantry, however elite. And here is the thing the Greeks understood better than they liked to admit. Because the Persian way of war was built on the horse and the bow, on the mounted archer and the mobility and the arrow storm. A way of war descended from the steppe and the plateau, from a people who had learned to fight in the wide open spaces where you did not close with your enemy and grapple him in a crush of shields, but rode around him and shot him full of arrows from a distance, wearing him down, refusing the close fight, killing at range. And this was a superb way of war, flexible and deadly, and it dominated the open battlefields of Asia for centuries. And it had only one great weakness, which the Greeks, by an accident of their own poverty and their own stony, cramped country, happened to be built precisely to exploit. Because the one thing the arrow storm could not easily break was a dense, deep, heavily armored mass of infantry packed shoulder to shoulder behind a wall of overlapping shields. Each man's shield covering his neighbor, the bronze face of the phalanx presented unbroken to the arrows. And if such a mass could once close the distance, could endure the arrows long enough to come to grips, its weight and its long spears and its armor would shatter the more lightly armed archers who had never been meant to stand and receive a charge like that. And this, exactly this, is what happened at Marathon and at Plataea. Not the triumph of free men over slaves, not the victory of a superior race, but the meeting of two different and equally valid ways of war on the one kind of ground, the narrow enclosed battlefield that happened to favor one of them. The Greek heavy infantry catching the Persian army on terrain where its cavalry and its archery could not do their proper work, and where the phalanx, once it closed, could not be stopped. The Persian army was not a horde, and it was not servile, and it was not inferior. It was an army built for a different war, the war of the open plains and the mounted archer, and it lost, on a few famous days, to an army built for the one kind of fighting the Persian system was worst at, and the whole racial legend of West against East, of the free spear against the slave bow, is only the misreading of a tactical accident, the Greeks mistaking the luck of the ground for the judgment of the gods. Now we ride west, at last, to the war that the world has never forgotten, the war between the vast Persian Empire and the small quarrelsome Greek cities of the far western edge. And I have to prepare you for it, because you already know this story, or you think you do. And almost everything you think you know about it comes from one side, the Greek side, told with incomparable art by men of genius, and it is one of the greatest stories ever told. And it is also, in its shape and its meaning, a piece of magnificent propaganda, and the whole challenge of telling it honestly is to hold both of those truths at once, to feel the real grandeur of the Greek achievement, and to see, at the same time, how the very grandeur of the telling has warped, for 25 centuries, our sense of what the thing actually was. Here is the first thing to understand, and it is the thing the Greek telling makes hardest to feel. From the point of view of the Persian Empire, the Greeks were not the great enemy, not the defining foe, not the mighty rival civilization locked with Persia in a struggle for the fate of the world. From the point of view of Susa, the Greeks were a remote, poor, fractious collection of small city-states on the far western fringe of the known world, quarreling endlessly among themselves in their stony little country, of interest chiefly because some of them, the Ionian Greeks of the Aegean coast, were already Persian subjects, inherited from Lydia, and because the mainland ones had an irritating habit of meddling in the affairs of those subjects. The wars that the Greeks would remember as the supreme crisis of their existence, the very hinge of history, the moment when freedom itself was saved from slavery, were to the Persian court a pair of frontier expeditions against some troublesome barbarians at the edge of the map, one of which ended in an annoying but minor defeat, and the other in a larger and more expensive failure. Campaigns of real cost and real embarrassment, certainly, but not the central drama of the empire's life, not remotely, because the empire was vast and its concerns were many, and the Greeks were, in the great scheme of Persian affairs, a small and distant problem on one frontier among many. To read the Greek historians, you would think the whole weight and attention and destiny of Persia was bent upon the conquest of Greece. To read the situation as the Persians must have seen it, Greece was a nuisance on the rim, and this gap between the earth-shaking importance the story had for the Greeks and the marginal importance it had for the Persians is the single most important thing to hold on to, and the hardest, because the Greek telling is so overwhelming, so beautifully made, that it swallows your sense of proportion whole. The trouble began, as troubles on the Persian western frontier tended to begin, with the Ionian Greeks, the Greek cities of the Aegean coast that Cyrus had inherited from Lydia, and that had chafed on and off under Persian rule ever since. Not because Persian rule was especially harsh, it was not, but because they were Greeks, and Greeks did not love being ruled by anyone, and Persia governed the Ionian cities in the Persian way, through local men. But the local men Persia backed were tyrants, single rulers propped up by Persian power, and the Greeks, whose political imagination was already turning toward the radical idea that free men should govern themselves, resented the tyrants, and behind them the empire. And around the year 499 BC, the Ionian cities rose in revolt against Persia, a great rebellion of the Greek coast, and they sent west across the sea to the free cities of the Greek mainland for help. And most of the mainland cities, sensibly, declined to poke the enormous eastern bear. But two did send aid, a few ships, a small force, and one of the two was a rising, ambitious, democratic city called Athens. And the Ionian revolt, in its course, did a thing that Athens would come to regret for a generation, because the rebels and their Athenian allies marched inland and took and burned the western Persian capital of the region, the city of Sardis, the old seat of Croesus, burning in the sack a temple of the local gods. And word of this outrage, of Greeks from across the sea burning a city and a temple of the great king's realm, came in time to Darius himself in the heart of the empire. And here the Greeks tell a story that may be legend but is too good and too revealing to leave out. That Darius, on hearing that these obscure Western Greeks, these Athenians, had dared to burn Sardis, asked who the Athenians even were. So little did they signify to him. And then, informed, took his bow and shot an arrow into the sky and prayed to the wise Lord to grant him vengeance upon the Athenians, and commanded one of his servants to repeat to him 3 times every day before dinner, "Master, remember the Athenians," so that the small, distant insult would not be forgotten amid the great affairs of the empire. Whether he truly did it or not, the story catches something real, the way the Greek business was, for Persia, a minor score to be settled, a frontier insult to be punished when convenient, filed among 1,000 larger concerns. And remember the Athenians, the daily reminder, is itself the measure of how easily, without the reminder, the Athenians might have been forgotten. The Ionian revolt was, in the end, crushed, as such things were, the Persian Empire bringing its vast resources slowly to bear, retaking the rebel cities one by one, and dealing with the ringleader city, Miletus, in the hard way that even Persia sometimes dealt with those who defied it, sacking it and deporting its people, a brutality that shocked even the Greeks, and that shows us that the Persian velvet glove had an iron hand inside it when it was pushed too far. But the revolt was over, and the Ionian coast was Persian again, and there remained only the matter of the mainland cities that had meddled, the punishment of Athens and its small ally. And it was to administer that punishment, that frontier chastisement, that Darius sent. In the year 490 BC, an expedition across the Aegean, a naval force to sail to Greece, punish the offending cities, and reduce them. A limited operation with a limited aim, and it landed its troops on a plain on the coast of Attica, near a place whose name you know, because it has come down through 25 centuries and is spoken even now, by people running a certain distance who have no idea they are invoking an ancient battle, the plain of Marathon. At Marathon, the Athenians, with a small contingent from one loyal neighbor and standing essentially alone, the mighty Spartans, for reasons of religious scruple, having delayed and arrived too late, met the Persian landing force in the open field, and they won. And I want to tell you honestly both how remarkable that was, and how much smaller it was than the legend it became. It was remarkable because the citizen soldiers of Athens, the heavily armored spearmen the Greeks called hoplites, fighting in their dense shield wall formation, the phalanx, proved on that day that in a straight infantry clash on ground that suited them, the Greek heavy infantry could shatter the more lightly armed troops of the Persian expeditionary force, that the phalanx, when it could close, was a battering ram against which the Persian infantry line, built for a different kind of war, could not stand, and the Athenians drove the invaders back into the sea with heavy loss and saved their city, and it was a genuine and astonishing victory. A small, free city defeating the expeditionary force of the greatest empire in the world, and the Athenians were rightly and permanently proud of it, and they buried their war dead, a bare 192 of them, in a great mound on the battlefield that you can still see today, and they held the memory of Marathon as the proudest thing their city had ever done, the day the men of Athens stood alone and turned back the east, and I do not want to take 1 ounce of that pride away from them, because it was earned in blood, on that plain, by men who had every reason to be afraid and stood anyway. But hold the proportion, because it matters. Marathon was not the defeat of the Persian Empire. It was the repulse of a single punitive expedition, a frontier force sent to chastise a rebellious edge, and while its loss was an embarrassment and a check, it did not shake the empire. It did not even greatly concern the empire. It was a bloody nose delivered to a raiding party at the far end of the world, and the vast machine of Persia, when the news came, simply began, without panic, to prepare a proper answer, a real invasion, on a scale that would leave no doubt. And here we should note the famous run, the origin of that word marathon that people now attach to any long ordeal, the story that a Greek messenger ran from the battlefield all the way to Athens with news of the victory, and gasped out his message and dropped dead of the effort. A story that is almost certainly a later invention, a beautiful accretion, muddled together from a different and better attested run in the sources, the run of a professional courier sent before the battle the far greater distance from Athens to Sparta to beg for help. But the legend of the dying runner, false as it probably is, has utterly conquered the world, so that a race of a particular distance is now run in every country on earth in memory of a message that likely no one ever carried. And there is something so perfectly characteristic in that, in the way the Greek version of this whole war has planted itself in the deep soil of our imagination, that even our exercise, even the word for our endurance, is a Greek memory of a Persian defeat. And the Persian side of it, the actual expedition and its actual aims and its actual limited recoverable failure, has left no word in any language at all. Darius, hearing of Marathon, resolved on the full conquest of Greece, the real thing this time, and began the vast preparations. But he was an old man now, near the end of his long reign, and there was trouble in the empire, a great revolt in Egypt to be dealt with, and before he could launch the invasion he died, in the year 486 BC, after 36 years on the throne, the true builder of the empire, the maker of the machine, the carver of the cliff, gone at last, and he was buried, as the great Persian kings were now buried, not under a little stone house like Cyrus, but in a tomb cut high into the face of a cliff, at a place near Persepolis called Naksh-i-Rostam, where the tombs of Darius and the kings who followed him were carved into the living rock in the shape of great crosses, their facades sculpted to look like the front of a palace, with the king shown above, standing on a platform borne up by the peoples of the empire, worshipping before the fire and the winged symbol of the wise lord. The same argument as the Persepolis stairway carved now onto the cliff of the royal dead. The empire as a thing held up lovingly by the many nations. And there Darius was laid, high in the rock, looking out forever over the plain of the ceremonial capital he had built, and the great war he had willed past, unfinished, to his son. And the son's name was Xerxes. Xerxes is, in the Greek telling, the very archetype of the Eastern despot in his pride and his fall, the vast, vain, luxurious king who led the greatest army the world had ever seen against the little free cities and was humbled by them. And this portrait, painted above all in the tragedy that an Athenian playwright staged only a handful of years after the events, while the memory was raw, is so powerful and so influential that Xerxes has become less a man than a symbol, the embodiment of overweening power brought low, and it is worth remembering, before we watch him march, that the playwright who created that enduring image, Aeschylus, had himself fought against the Persians, had stood in the battle line, had a brother who died in the war, and wrote his great tragedy of the Persian defeat for an Athenian audience that had lived through the terror of it, so that the founding portrait of Xerxes is the work of an enemy and a veteran, made for a city celebrating its own survival. And while it is a work of genuine and even generous art, generous enough to give the defeated Persians dignity and grief, it is not, and was never meant to be, history. Xerxes inherited his father's war and pursued it with his father's thoroughness, and on a scale that dwarfed everything before, and the preparations he made became legendary in the Greek imagination for their sheer ambition, because Xerxes meant to bring the whole weight of the empire to bear on Greece at once, to march an enormous army overland along the coast, supported by an enormous fleet at sea, the two moving together, the fleet feeding the army. And to do this he undertook engineering works that the Greeks remembered with a shudder as the very image of a man overreaching the natural order. He had a canal cut through the neck of a peninsula so that his fleet could avoid a dangerous cape where an earlier Persian fleet had been wrecked, a real and sensible piece of military engineering that the Greeks remembered as monstrous pride. The king so arrogant he carved through the land itself. And to cross from Asia into Europe, over the narrow strait of the Hellespont, he had his engineers build a bridge of boats, a double line of ships lashed together across the water with great cables, a roadway laid over them, so that his army could march dry-shod from one continent to the other. And the Greeks told of this bridge the most famous story of Xerxes' pride, that when a storm came up and wrecked the first bridge his engineers built, the king in his fury ordered the very sea to be punished, commanded that the Hellespont be given 300 lashes with a whip and branded with hot irons and cursed as a treacherous stream, and had the engineers who had built the broken bridge beheaded, a story of a man so drunk on power that he would flog the ocean for disobeying him. And it is a wonderful story, and it may even hold some grain of a real royal rage at a costly delay, but it is, in its shape, exactly the kind of story a free people tells about the tyrant they defeated. The parable of hubris made flesh, the king who thought himself master even of the sea, and we should file it where we filed the murdered bull and the exposed infant, among the things that are true about what people needed to believe rather than about what happened. The army Xerxes led across that bridge and down into Greece was, the Greeks said, the greatest ever assembled. And they gave it numbers that stagger belief. Millions of men, so many that they drank rivers dry, drawn from every nation of the empire. And the modern historian knows that the numbers are wildly, impossibly inflated. The honest estimates running to perhaps a couple of 100,000, itself an enormous force for the age. A logistical marvel to feed and move, but nothing like the millions of the legend, and the inflation itself is part of the story, because the bigger the horde the Greeks faced, the greater their victory in facing it, so that the Greek tradition had every reason to multiply the enemy without limit, and did. And Herodotus, describing the great army as it gathered, gives us a scene that is worth keeping, even though it is surely more poem than report. The scene of Xerxes reviewing his countless host from a hilltop, looking out over the whole vast multitude and the fleet covering the sea, and at first rejoicing in his own greatness and his own power, and then suddenly weeping. And when his uncle asks him why he weeps in the very hour of his glory, the king answers that he was overcome with pity when he considered the shortness of human life. For of all these countless thousands of men, not one would be alive in 100 years. And it is one of the most extraordinary passages in all of ancient literature. This moment given by a Greek enemy to the great Persian king, a moment not of pride, but of the deepest and most universal human sorrow. The sorrow at the passing of all living things, and whatever Xerxes truly felt on whatever hilltop, the fact that his enemies remembered him weeping over the mortality of his own soldiers, and kept the memory and honored it, tells you that even in the heat of the war, the Greeks knew, at some level, that the man they fought was a man, and that his soldiers were men, and that all of them, the countless host and the little free cities alike, were bound together under the same short sky, and that, more than any battle, is why this story has lasted. Because at its best, even at its most one-sided, it never quite forgot that the enemy could weep. And so, we come to the two most famous moments of the whole war, the two the world has told and retold in poems and paintings and films, the stand at the pass and the battle in the strait, and I will tell them to you as they deserve to be told, with all their real grandeur, and then I will tell you what they were, because the two are not the same, and the difference is the whole education this war has to give. As the enormous army of Xerxes came down through northern Greece, the Greek cities that had chosen to resist, a minority of them, most of the Greek world having either joined the Persians or sat the war out, gathered their small forces to try to hold him, and they chose to make a stand at a narrow pass on the coast, a place where the mountains came down close to the sea, and the road squeezed through a gap only wide enough for a few to pass abreast, a place called the Hot Gates, Thermopylae, where the vast numbers of the Persian army would count for little because only a few could come at the defenders at once. And there the Greek force, its heart a body of 300 Spartans led by their king Leonidas, took its position to hold the gate, and for 2 days they held it, the Persian assaults breaking again and again on the Greek spears in the narrow place, the numbers of the great army useless in the choke of the pass, until a local trader showed the Persians a mountain path around the back, and Leonidas, learning that he was about to be surrounded, sent away the greater part of the Greek force to save it and stayed himself, with his 300 Spartans and a few hundred others who would not leave, to hold the pass to the end and die. And die they did, all of them, fighting until their spears broke, and then with their swords, and then, the story says, with their hands and their teeth, buying with their lives the time the rest of Greece needed. And over their grave the Greeks set a stone with an inscription that is perhaps the most famous epitaph ever written, a message from the dead to the living, telling the passerby to go and tell the Spartans that here, obedient to their laws, we lie, and there is no undoing the grandeur of it. And I would not if I could, because whatever else Thermopylae was, it was 300 men choosing to stay and die for something larger than themselves. And that choice, that particular human choice, is one of the permanent glories of our species, and it does not matter that they were, by our lights, a harsh and narrow people from a brutal warrior society built on the backs of enslaved neighbors, because on that day, in that pass, they showed what it looks like when human beings will not run, and the world has been right to remember it. But now, the proportion. Thermopylae was a Greek defeat. Let that sit for a moment against everything the legend has made of it, because the legend has so thoroughly transmuted the last stand into a kind of victory of the spirit that people forget the plain military fact, which is that the pass was forced, the defenders were killed, the Persian army marched through and went on south, and took, in the weeks that followed, the city of Athens itself, whose people had abandoned it and burned the temples on the sacred hill of the Acropolis in revenge, the Greeks said, for the burning of Sardis long before, so that the great campaign, at this point, was going almost entirely the Persians' way, the north overrun, the heroic stand at the pass swept aside, Athens taken and in flames, the war, by any sober accounting, being won by Xerxes. The 300 died gloriously, and they died in a lost battle in a losing campaign. And the reason we remember Thermopylae as we do, as a kind of triumph, is that the Greeks who survived the war needed the dead of the past to have meant something, needed the sacrifice to be the seed of the eventual victory, and told it that way so magnificently that the telling conquered the memory of the defeat. And there is a lesson in that too, in how a people can take the worst day and make of it, by sheer force of meaning, the thing that holds them together. And it is not a dishonest lesson, because the dead of Thermopylae really did buy time and really did give the rest of Greece an example that stiffened its will. But it is a lesson in how the stories we most cherish are often built on the ground of defeat, painted over so thoroughly with meaning that we forget the field was lost. The real turning of the war came not in the pass but in the water, in the narrow strait between the island of Salamis and the coast near the burning city of Athens. And here, at last, the Greeks won something that was not a glorious defeat, but a decisive and war-changing victory. And it was won by the city that had the most to lose and had already lost it, Athens, whose people, evacuated from their burning homes, watched from the shore or fought from the decks as the two fleets met. In the years since Marathon, Athens had done a far-sighted thing, had found a rich vein of silver in its own soil, and had chosen, at the urging of a shrewd and slippery politician named Themistocles, to spend the windfall not on itself, but on a great fleet of warships, the swift-oared galleys called triremes, so that when Xerxes came, Athens, though its land was overrun and its city burned, was the greatest naval power in Greece, and its wooden walls, the ships, in the riddling words of an oracle that Themistocles had cannily interpreted, were the thing that would save it. And in the Strait of Salamis, the Greek fleet, smaller but fighting in narrow waters that took away the Persian advantage of numbers, met the great Persian navy and broke it, the crowded Persian ships fouling one another in the confined channel, unable to bring their numbers to bear, the Greek triremes ramming and sinking them in the press. And Xerxes, the story says, watched the destruction of his fleet from a golden throne set up on the shore, watched his navy shattered in an afternoon in the water below him. And the loss of the fleet was the loss of the war, because the enormous army could not be supplied deep in hostile Greece without the fleet to feed it along the coast. And so Xerxes, his navy broken, withdrew the bulk of his forces back toward Asia, leaving a picked army behind under a general to try to finish the conquest the next year. And that army too was destroyed, the following summer, by the combined Greek forces in a great land battle at Plataea, where the Spartan-led hoplites once again proved that in a straight fight the Greek phalanx could break the Persian line. And with that double defeat, the fleet at Salamis and the army at Plataea, the great invasion of Greece was over, and it had failed. Now I have to do the hardest thing in this whole night, which is to tell you honestly what the Greek victory meant, because you have been taught, we have all been taught, whether we know it or not, that it meant almost everything. That at Salamis and Plataea the freedom of the West was saved from the slavery of the East. That if the Persians had won, the light of Greek civilization would have been snuffed out, and with it democracy and philosophy and drama and reason and all that grew from them, so that we, their distant heirs, would be living in a darker world, and that the little free cities, in turning back the great king, saved not only themselves, but the whole future of human freedom. And this is a magnificent story, and it is the story the Greeks told, and it has been the story of the West about itself ever since. And I want to handle it gently, because there is truth in it. But the truth in it is smaller and stranger than the legend, and the legend has done real harm. Here is the truth in it. The Greek cities that resisted were, by the standards of their world, unusually free, and one of them, Athens, was in the midst of the boldest political experiment the world had yet seen, the experiment of democracy, of government by the assembled citizens themselves, and in the decades after the war, drawing enormous confidence and enormous resources from their victory. The Athenians produced an explosion of achievement, in drama and philosophy and history and art and architecture, so concentrated and so brilliant that it has shaped everything the West has thought and made ever since. And it is at least possible, though it can never be proved, that a Persian conquest would have smothered that particular flowering in its bud, would have folded Athens into the empire as one more subject city under one more Persian-backed tyrant, and that the Golden Age would never have come. And so it is fair, it is not wrong, to feel that something precious and fragile was preserved on that day in the strait, that the victory bought the space in which a unique thing could grow. But here is what the legend gets wrong, and it gets it wrong in ways that have poisoned a great deal of later thinking. It gets wrong, first, the idea that this was a war of freedom against slavery, of West against East, because that framing is itself a piece of Greek and later Western propaganda, and it does not survive contact with the facts. The Persian Empire was not a uniquely oppressive tyranny. It was, as we have spent this whole night seeing, in many ways an unusually tolerant and well-run state that let its peoples keep their gods and their laws and their customs, that governed by system and contract more than by terror. And the Greek cities were not a united front of noble freedom. Most of them fought on the Persian side or stayed neutral, and the ones that resisted spent the years before and after the war fighting viciously among themselves. And the great free democratic Athens that saved civilization used the prestige and the fleet it won in the war to build, within a single generation, its own empire over the other Greek cities, an empire it ruled with a heavy and sometimes brutal hand, crushing the revolts of its subject cities, so that the champions of Greek freedom became, almost at once, the masters of other Greeks, and the whole neat picture of free West against slave East dissolves, on inspection, into something much muddier and more human. A war in which neither side had a monopoly on freedom or on tyranny, in which the great tolerant empire fought the small brilliant quarrelsome cities, and the cities won, on their own ground, in their own strait, and then went on being as capable of domination as anyone. And the legend gets wrong, most damagingly, the deep idea it planted, the idea of a permanent, essential opposition between the West and the East, between European freedom and Asiatic despotism, between us and them, an idea that was born in the propaganda of these wars. In the Greek need to make sense of their fight against the great empire by casting it as a struggle of free European men against servile Asiatic hordes. And that has echoed down 25 centuries, through the Romans and the Crusades and the colonial empires and into our own day, this notion of a civilizational fault line between West and East, with all the virtue on one side. And it is one of the most consequential and most poisonous ideas the ancient world ever produced. And it was, at its root, a story the Greeks told to make their frontier war with a tolerant empire into a cosmic drama of freedom and slavery. And the tragedy is that the story was so beautifully told that we have believed it in one form or another ever since, and built a great deal of our sense of ourselves on a caricature of a people, the Persians, who were in truth not the servile despotism of the legend, but the builders of the first empire that ever tried, however imperfectly, to hold the whole world together in something other than terror. I do not say this to run down the Greeks, whose achievement was real and whose courage was real and whose freedom, such as it was a genuine and precious thing. I say it because you deserve, in the deep quiet of the night, to hear both sides of the oldest one-sided story in our civilization, to feel the grandeur of Thermopylae and Salamis, and also to know that the enemy those battles were fought against was not a monster, but an empire, and a remarkable one, and that the men on the other side of the strait, drowning in the crowded water below Xerxes' golden throne, were not the faceless slaves of the legend, but the sailors of the Phoenician cities, and the soldiers of 100 nations, each with his own god and his own home, and his own short life under the same sky, dying in a frontier war that meant everything to the winners and was, to the empire that lost it, a costly failure on one distant edge of a world so vast that the loss, real as it was, could be absorbed, and was, and the empire went on, for another 150 years, ruling half the human race, while the Greeks who had beaten it turned, almost at once, to the far more absorbing business of fighting one another. And here the popular story of Persia essentially stops, and that is itself a symptom of the disease we have been diagnosing all night, because the Greek sources lose interest in Persia once the Great War is over. Once Persia has served its purpose as the dark backdrop against which Greek freedom shone, and so the century and a half of Persian history that followed the failure in Greece, the long afternoon of the empire, is told to us, when it is told at all, mostly as a story of decline, of court intrigue and harem murder and weak kings and slow rot, the standard tale of Oriental decadence. And it is worth pausing to insist that this too is largely a distortion, that the empire in its long afternoon was not a corpse slowly cooling, but a functioning great power, the richest and largest state in the world, that went on ruling its vast domains, collecting its tribute, maintaining its roads, building its palaces, and playing the game of nations with skill for 150 years after the day the Greek legend treats as its effective death, and that the picture of unbroken decline is once again the enemy's picture. The perspective of Greeks who could only see Persia as either the great threat or the decaying hulk, and never simply as what it was, an empire living its ordinary imperial life. That life was not without its darkness, and I will not pretend otherwise, because the succession struggles of the later Persian kings really were bloody, and the court really was a place of faction and murder, of queens and eunuchs and princes maneuvering, of heirs killed and kings poisoned, and the Greek writers who served at the Persian court, and there were several, physicians and mercenaries and exiles, brought back tales of the intrigues that lost nothing in the telling. And it is true that no later king of Persia matched Cyrus in generosity or Darius in system, and true that the great creative burst of the empire's founding was not repeated. But it is also true, and less often told, that the empire's most brilliant weapon in its long afternoon was not its army but its gold, and that Persia, having failed to conquer the Greeks by force, spent the next century conquering them by wealth, learning that the surest way to control the quarrelsome Greek cities was not to send armies against them, but to fund their endless wars against one another, to pay whichever side served Persian interests, to keep the Greeks so busy fighting among themselves that they could never again unite against the empire. And this policy, the policy of the king's gold, of the Daric archer buying with silver what the spear had failed to win, worked so well that a later Persian king could boast with justice that he was the arbiter of Greece, that the exhausted Greek cities, having worn themselves out in a long and terrible war among themselves, came at last to the Persian king to have their peace dictated, so that the very Greeks who had beaten Persia in the field ended by begging Persia to settle their quarrels, and the empire that lost at Salamis ruled the victors in the end through their own greed and their own division. And there is a hard wisdom in that, in the discovery that a free and quarrelsome people can be mastered not by conquering them, but by paying them to destroy themselves. And it is a discovery that has been made and used by many powers since. One episode from the long afternoon deserves telling at length, because it is one of the great adventure stories of the ancient world, and because it shows us the later empire from the inside, through Greek eyes that were, for once, actually there. And it is the story the Greeks called the March of the 10,000. Late in the 5th century, a Persian prince named Cyrus, a younger son named for the great founder, governor of the western provinces, resolved to seize the throne from his elder brother, the reigning king, and to do it he hired, among his forces, a great body of Greek mercenaries, 10,000 of them and more, the hardy professional soldiers that war-torn Greece now produced in abundance. And he led this army deep into the heart of the empire, all the way to the plains near Babylon, to fight his brother for the crown. And there, in a great battle, the rebel prince's Greek mercenaries won their part of the field, broke the troops in front of them. But the prince himself, charging recklessly at his brother, was killed, and with his death the whole enterprise collapsed, and the 10,000 Greeks found themselves suddenly stranded, deep in the middle of the Persian Empire, 1,000 miles from home, their employer dead, their cause lost, surrounded by the enormous forces of a king who wanted them destroyed, with no supplies, no allies, and no way home but to fight their way out through the whole hostile breadth of the empire. And their generals were treacherously seized and killed at a parley, so that they were leaderless as well as stranded. And it seemed certain they would all die there in the heart of Asia. And instead they elected new leaders from their own ranks. Among them a young Athenian gentleman named Xenophon, the same who would later write the admiring life of the elder Cyrus. And under their new leaders they began one of the most extraordinary retreats in history, marching north, fighting all the way, through the territories of hostile subject peoples and across terrible mountains in the depths of winter, holding their formation, keeping their discipline, burying their dead, until at last, after months of marching and fighting through the wild highlands, the vanguard came over a mountain pass and saw, in the distance, the glint of water, and began to shout, and the cry ran back down the whole struggling column, "The sea, the sea." Because the sea was the road home, the sea was Greece. The sea meant they had made it, and men wept and embraced one another on the mountainside at the sight of the far water. And Xenophon wrote it all down, the whole march, in a book that survives. And it is one of the great human documents of antiquity, and I keep it here, near the end of the empire's story, for two reasons. Because the sea is one of the purest cries of joy in all of literature, and I wanted you to have it in the dark. And because the March of the 10,000 taught the Greek world a lesson that would prove fatal to the empire, the lesson that the vast Persian realm, for all its size and wealth, could be marched through, that a determined body of good Greek infantry could penetrate to its very heart and fight its way out again, that the giant up close was not invulnerable. And there was a young man in the Greek world, a generation later, a Macedonian king, who studied the march of the 10,000 very carefully, and drew from it the boldest possible conclusion that what 10,000 stranded mercenaries had done by accident, an army led with genius might do on purpose, and not merely march through the empire, but take it. Before we ride to the fall, I want to linger on one of the strangest and most beautiful afterlives of the Persian Empire, which is the way it lives on, preserved and vivid and full of court intrigue and banquet and gold, in the pages of a book that has nothing to do with Persia at all, a book of another people entirely, the Hebrew Bible, because the Jews, whom Cyrus had freed from their Babylonian exile and sent home to rebuild their temple, lived on for centuries afterward as subjects of the Persian king, and they remembered the empire, and they wrote it down, and their memory of it, half history and half story, is one of the fullest and most human portraits of the Persian court that survives from anyone. And it comes, once again, from the outside, from a people the Persians ruled, so that even here, even in the friendliest of the outside voices, we meet the empire not in its own words, but reflected in the memory of those who lived under it. The Jews remembered Cyrus, as we have seen, as the anointed of the Lord, the shepherd chosen by God himself to end their exile, the only foreign king in all their scriptures to be given that sacred title, and the gratitude of it echoes down through their sacred literature, the memory of the great king who, when he could have done anything, chose to let a small conquered people go home to their God. But they remembered the later empire too, and remembered it not with the awe of the liberated but with the intimate, ambivalent, closely observed knowledge of people who had lived inside it for generations, and nowhere more vividly than in the book that bears the name of a Jewish queen of Persia, the Book of Esther, which is set entirely within the Persian court, at the winter capital of Susa, in the reign of a king the Hebrew calls Ahasuerus, whom most scholars identify with Xerxes himself, the very king who wept on the hilltop and marched against Greece. And the book opens with a scene of Persian royal splendor that no Persian source ever gave us so richly, a feast of the king lasting 180 days, and then 7 days more. The court hung with white and blue and purple. The couches of gold and silver on a pavement of marble and mother of pearl. The wine served in vessels of gold, no two alike. The whole overwhelming abundance of the Persian feast described by a people who had actually stood in that court and seen it. And against that glittering backdrop, the book tells its story of a Jewish girl who becomes the queen of the king of the world, and of the plot against her people, and of how she risks her life to approach the king unbidden, which even the queen could not do without the king extending his golden scepter to spare her, and of how she turns the plot aside and saves her people. And the whole tale, whatever its history, is soaked in real and specific knowledge of the Persian court, its protocols and its dangers and its splendors. The king who cannot even recall a loyal servant's reward until it is read to him from the royal chronicles kept, as we know from the tablets, with such care. The law of the Medes and the Persians that, once written and sealed with the king's ring, cannot be revoked even by the king himself. That famous, unchangeable law that the Jews remembered as a byword for the strange rigidity of Persian justice. And it is one of the small marvels of this whole story, that the fullest surviving picture of the daily life of the Persian court, the feasts and the protocols and the scepter and the sealed unbreakable law, comes not from Persia at all, but from a book of the people Persia ruled, remembered and written and cherished and read aloud, to this very year, at a joyful festival, so that the court of Xerxes lives on, in loving and terrifying detail, in the scripture and the celebration of another nation entirely, 25 centuries after the last of its feasts grew cold. And the Jews remembered the empire in the book of Daniel too, with its visions of the rise and fall of kingdoms, its famous scenes at the royal court, the writing that appears upon the wall at the doomed feast of Babylon, and its picture of the Persian king who signs, in the rigid Persian way, a decree he cannot afterward revoke even to save the servant he loves, and must therefore, weeping, allow the man to be cast to the lions, only to find him spared by his God in the morning. And whatever the history beneath these stories, they show us the same thing, the empire preserved in the memory of the ruled, its power and its danger and its strange unbreakable laws, its kings glimpsed from below by the subject peoples who lived in the shadow of the throne. And it is fitting, it is almost too fitting, that an empire whose own voice was so thoroughly lost, buried under the Greek version of its story until men climbed a cliff to recover its speech, should live on so vividly in the sacred books of the peoples it conquered, remembered by the freed exiles of Cyrus and the queen at the court of Xerxes and the prophet before the lions, so that when we look for the Persian Empire we find it again and again, not in its own words but shining in the memory of others. The great king reflected in the eyes of the small nations who watched him from the floor of his golden hall and kept what they saw and handed it down. His name was Alexander, and he was the king of Macedon, a half-Greek kingdom on the northern edge of the Greek world that the southern cities had long looked down on as half-barbarous. And his father Philip had done the thing the Persians had spent a century preventing, had united the Greek cities, or most of them, under his own leadership, not as free allies but as subjects of Macedon, so that when Philip was murdered and the crown passed to his 20-year-old son, that son inherited a united Greek world and a superb professional army, and a plan his father had already laid, the plan to invade the Persian Empire, to cross into Asia and turn the tables of 150 years, to make the Greeks the conquerors and Persia the conquered. And Alexander, who was one of those rare and terrible figures who appear a handful of times in all of history, a man of boundless ambition and boundless ability, and a kind of divine or demonic self-belief that recognized no limit at all, took up his father's plan and made of it something his father had never dreamed. The conquest not of a piece of the empire, but of the whole of it, the entire world of Persia, from the Aegean to India, in a single decade, by a single man, before he was 33 years old. I will not tell the whole of Alexander's conquest tonight, because it is another story, and a Greek one, and this is the Persian's night. But I have to tell you enough to bring the empire to its end, and I want to tell it, as much as I can, from the Persian side, from the side of the great king who had to watch this young whirlwind come out of the west and tear apart in 10 years what had stood for 200. The king who faced Alexander was Darius III, a man who has come down to us through the Greek and Roman sources that glorified his conqueror as a coward and a weakling, the last feeble heir of a decayed line, fleeing from every battle. And this portrait, like every Persian portrait painted by the winners, deserves our suspicion because Darius III was, by other accounts, a brave man and an experienced soldier who had come to the throne in the usual bloody way, and who now faced, through no fault of his own, the single greatest military genius of the ancient world at the head of the finest army in the world, and lost, as almost anyone would have lost, and whose flight from the lost battles was not simple cowardice, but the reasonable calculation of a king who knew that as long as he lived and was free, the empire had a rallying point, that his own survival was worth more to Persia than his death in a hopeless fight. Twice the great armies met, at Issus and then at Gaugamela, and twice Alexander, outnumbered by sheer tactical brilliance and the shock power of his Macedonian cavalry and infantry, broke the huge Persian host, driving straight at the person of the great king himself, aiming to break the enemy's will by threatening its head. And twice Darius, his center collapsing around him, was forced to flee the field to fight another day. And after the second defeat, at Gaugamela, the day the empire's fate was sealed, Alexander marched on into the heart of Persia and took, one after another, the great cities of the empire, Babylon opening its gates to him as it had opened them to Cyrus 2 centuries before, and then Susa with its treasures, and then at last Persepolis itself, the ceremonial heart of the empire, the terrace of the great stairway, and the 100 columns, the throne of the world. And at Persepolis, Alexander did a thing that he seems to have regretted almost at once, and that stands as the fire-lit period at the end of the empire's sentence. The great palace complex, the Apadana and the halls and the treasuries, the whole magnificent argument in stone that Darius and Xerxes had raised, the stairway of the gathered nations, all of it, Alexander burned. Whether in a calculated act of vengeance, the symbolic answer at last to the burning of Athens by Xerxes 150 years before, a fire for a fire, the destruction of the enemy's holiest place to announce that the long war was finally over and Greece had won, or whether, as another old story has it, in a drunken revel, at the urging of a courtesan, when the wine was flowing and someone cried out that they should burn the palace of the Persians in revenge for the temples of Athens, and the whole reveling company took up torches and ran laughing through the halls, setting the cedar roofs alight. We cannot be sure, and perhaps it was something of both, policy and drunkenness braided together as they so often are. But the result is not in doubt, because the fire fell on the great terrace, and the cedar burned, and the roofs came down, and the palaces of the King of Kings, the throne of the First World Empire, went up in flame in the night, and the burning was so fierce that it baked hard and preserved, in the ruins of the treasury, the very clay tablets that would one day tell us of the paid working women and their birth rations, the fire that destroyed the empire's glory, accidentally saving the record of its ordinary decency. And the columns that the fire left standing, blackened and broken, are the columns that stand at Persepolis still. And if you go there now and walk up the great stairway past the carved procession of the nations, and stand among the fallen and fire-scarred stones under the enormous plateau sky, you are standing in the ash of the moment the First World Empire ended, in the place where the long story that began with a Highland king who would not destroy his enemies ended with a young conqueror who burned their masterpiece to the ground. Darius III did not long survive his capital, fleeing east, gathering what forces he could for a last stand that would never come. He was betrayed at the end by his own men, by a satrap of the eastern provinces who seized the king, and, as Alexander's pursuit closed in, murdered him and left his body by the roadside, so that the last king of the Achaemenid line, the heir of Cyrus and Darius the Great, died not in battle and not on his throne, but stabbed by a traitor and abandoned in the dust of a road in the far east of his own dying empire. And when Alexander came up and found the body of his great enemy lying there, murdered by a subordinate, the Greek and Roman sources tell that he was moved, that he covered the dead king with his own cloak, that he sent the body back to Persepolis to be buried with honor in the royal tombs of the Persian kings, and that he hunted down the satrap who had done the murder and had him executed for the killing of his king. And whether all of that is true or is the kind of noble gesture the sources love to attribute to their hero, it has, like Alexander's grief at the plundered tomb of Cyrus, the ring of one world conqueror doing reflexive honor to the majesty of the throne he had just destroyed, recognizing perhaps in the murdered king by the roadside an image of the fragility of his own greatness, for Alexander himself would be dead within a few years, at 32, in Babylon, in the very heart of the empire he had conquered, his own vast dominion torn apart at his death by his generals exactly as he had torn apart the dominion of the Persians. The wheel of fortune that the wise Solon had described to Croesus turning once more, as it always turns, and grinding the conqueror to dust beside the conquered. And so the Achaemenid Empire, the first of the Persian empires, the empire of Cyrus and Darius and Xerxes, the first state ever to rule half the human race, came to its end, 200 years and a little more after the Highland king rose against his Median masters. And if this were an ordinary story, that would be the close of it, the empire fallen, the palaces burned, the last king dead in the dust, the curtain down. But it is one of the deepest and least told truths of this whole subject that Persia did not die with the Achaemenids, that the idea of Persia, the memory of the empire, the sense of being heirs to Cyrus, proved so durable that it outlived not only the Achaemenids, but conqueror after conqueror after conqueror, rising again and again across more than 1,000 years, so that the fall of Persepolis was not the end of Persia, but only the end of its first act. And I would be doing you a disservice, in the deep quiet of this night, if I let you drift off believing that the burning of the Great Terrace was the last of it. Because the truest thing about Persia is not that it fell, but that it kept coming back. For a while, after Alexander, the lands of the old empire were ruled by Greeks, by the dynasty that one of Alexander's generals founded, a Greek kingdom laid over the Persian world, Greek kings in the palaces of the satraps, Greek cities planted across the plateau, the Greek language the tongue of the rulers, and it seemed that Persia might be dissolved at last into the wider Greek world that Alexander had spread across the east. But the plateau did not dissolve. Out of the northeast, off the edge of the old empire, came a people called the Parthians, horse lords in the old Iranian tradition, mounted archers of terrible skill, and over the 2nd and 1st centuries before Christ, they drove the Greeks out of the Iranian world and built a new empire, a Persian empire in all but the dynasty's origin, that took back the old heartlands and the old capitals and stood, for nearly 500 years, as the great rival of Rome in the east, the one power the Romans, who conquered nearly everything else they touched, could never conquer, the empire against which Rome's legions marched again and again into the eastern deserts and were, again and again, broken, most famously at a place called Carrhae, where a Roman army was annihilated by the Parthian horse archers and their feigned retreats and their endless arrows. The origin of that phrase we still use, the parting shot, the Parthian shot, the arrow fired backward over the horse's tail by the rider pretending to flee, and the Parthians held the line of the old Persian world against the greatest empire the West ever produced for 5 centuries, so that the Roman dream of conquering the East, of doing what Alexander had done, was broken on the plateau over and over, and Persia, under new masters, remained unconquered. And when the Parthians at last grew weak, Persia renewed itself yet again, and this time the renewal was conscious and deliberate and proud, because in the 3rd century of our era, a new dynasty rose from the very heartland of Persia, from Parsa itself, the original homeland, a line called the Sasanians, and they overthrew the Parthians and founded a new empire that looked back explicitly, defiantly, gloriously to the Achaemenids, to Cyrus and Darius as their ancestors and their model. A self-conscious revival of the old imperial idea. And the Sasanian kings carved their own great reliefs into the very same cliff at Nakshi Rostam, where Darius the Great lay in his tomb, carved their triumphs directly beneath the tombs of the Achaemenid kings, claiming the inheritance in the stone itself, and they made Zoroastrianism, the faith of the truth and the lie, the official religion of a great state as it had perhaps never quite been before. And they built a new Persian Empire that stood for 400 years and was, once again, the great rival of the West. Now the rival of Rome's heir, the Christian Empire of Byzantium. The two of them, Persia and Rome in the East, locked in a struggle for the Near East that ran on for centuries, exhausting them both, until, in the 7th century, out of the deserts of Arabia, came a new faith and a new people, the armies of Islam, and swept over the exhausted Sasanian Empire and conquered it. And the last Sasanian king, the last king of kings in the old line, fled east across his collapsing realm exactly as Darius III had fled from Alexander 1,000 years before, and was murdered in the end, exactly as Darius III had been murdered, betrayed, and killed by a lesser man, so that the last Zoroastrian emperor of Persia died in flight and betrayal in almost the identical way as the last Achaemenid emperor a full millennium earlier, the same tragic shape closing the same long story, twice across 1,000 years. And with him the last of the ancient Persian empires fell, and Persia became a land of Islam, as it remains. But even that was not the end, because here is the final, quiet marvel. The thing that outlasted every empire and every dynasty and every conquest, which is the sheer stubborn persistence of Persia as a civilization, as a language, as a way of being in the world, underneath all the conquerors. The Arabs conquered Persia, but Persia, in a sense, absorbed the conquerors, kept its own tongue, the Persian language surviving the flood of Arabic where so many other conquered languages drowned, and going on to become one of the great literary languages of the world, the language of poets whose names are still spoken with love across half the earth, and Persian culture, Persian art, Persian administration, the Persian idea of kingship and courtesy and the ordered garden and the running water, spread outward under Islam across an enormous swath of the world, so that the deep patterns of the plateau, the garden with its 4 channels of water, the very word for that walled garden of paradise that comes down through Greek into our own language as the word paradise itself, from an old Persian word for the royal enclosed garden, the whole civilization of Cyrus and Darius, though its empires all fell, never really died, but flowed on underneath, like water in a qanat, hidden and patient and alive, surfacing again and again in new forms across the centuries, down to the living nation on the plateau today, which still calls itself by the ancient name, the land of the Aryas, Iran, and whose people still, many of them, feel themselves the heirs of Cyrus, still visit the little stone house of his tomb at Pasargadae, still climb the great stairway of the burned terrace at Persepolis, and read, in the carved procession of the gathered nations, the memory of the empire that their remotest ancestors built, and that the whole world once, for a while, obeyed. Of all the things the Persians gave the world, and they gave a great many, from the road to the coinage to the very shape of provincial government, there is one gift so quiet and so universal that almost no one who receives it ever thinks of Persia at all, and it is a word. And behind the word an idea, and behind the idea a way of understanding what it might mean to be happy. And I want to give it to you now, near the end, because it is the gentlest thing in the whole story, and the most fitting to carry you down into sleep. The Persian kings and the Persian nobles, on their high dry plateau where water was the most precious thing in the world, built gardens, and the Persian garden was not the wild parkland of a hunting reserve, nor the vegetable plot of a farm, but a deliberate and formal and enclosed thing. a walled rectangle set against the dryness of the world outside, and into it they brought, by the buried channels of the Qanat, the precious water. And they ran it in 4 straight channels that crossed at the center, dividing the garden into 4 quarters, the water everywhere present, running and shining and cool, feeding the trees that gave shade and fruit, the roses and the flowering things, the whole a made place of water and green and shade and scent, walled off from the burning waste beyond, an image of order and abundance and rest carved out of the hostile dryness by human care and human water. And the Persians had a word for this walled garden, this enclosed paradise of running water, and the word in the old Persian tongue was something like Paradisa, the walled-around place. And the Greeks who saw these gardens and marveled at them borrowed the Persian word into their own language, and from Greek it passed onward, and it came at last, down the long road of the centuries, into the sacred languages of the West, where it took on a meaning larger than any earthly garden, because the word became the very name of heaven itself, the garden of God, the place of rest and water and shade at the end of all things, and the word, in English, is paradise, and it is a Persian word. And every time anyone anywhere speaks of paradise, of the paradise to come, of a paradise on earth, they are speaking, without knowing it, of a Persian nobleman's walled garden on the dry plateau, the 4 channels of water crossing at the center, the shade and the roses and the cool running water in the burning land, so that the highest heaven that half the world imagines is, at its linguistic root, a Persian garden, and the deepest human dream of rest at the end of everything wears, in our very language, the shape the Persians gave it, the enclosed green place where the precious water runs. And there is one more Persian gift that has outlived every empire and every conqueror, and is still, at this moment, celebrated by many millions of people across a great swath of the earth. And it is a festival, and it is perhaps the oldest continuously celebrated festival in the world, and its root is Zoroastrian and ancient, beyond the reach of certain dating, and it is the festival of the new day, Nowruz, which falls at the spring equinox, at the moment when the long cold of winter breaks and the light begins to win against the dark and the year turns toward warmth and growth. And this, of course, is no accident, because for a faith built on the war of the light against the dark, of the truth against the lie, the turning of the year toward the light, the victory of spring over winter, was the natural and the holiest moment of renewal, a small yearly image of the great final triumph of the light that was promised at the end of all things. And so the Persians kept, at the spring equinox, a festival of new beginnings, of the house cleaned and set in order, of the family gathered, of the fire and the water and the growing green things of spring set out, of forgiveness and fresh starts and the hope of the returning warmth. And they have kept it, across every conquest and every change of faith and every fall of every empire, for something like 3,000 years and perhaps far longer, so that this very spring and next spring and every spring, tens of millions of people from the plateau and far beyond it, across a great arc of the world, will gather their families and set out the green shoots and celebrate the turning of the year toward the light. Most of them never thinking of Cyrus or Darius or the war of the truth against the lie, and yet keeping, in the deepest and most joyful way a custom can be kept, the oldest festival of the oldest of the great faiths, the yearly promise, renewed at the equinox for 3,000 years, that the light will win, that the cold will break, that after the long dark there is always, always, a new day coming. And if I could give you only one thing to hold as you fall asleep tonight, it would be that the 3,000-year-old Persian faith still kept every spring by millions, that the dark is not forever, and that the new day comes. It is worth being honest, here at the end, in the last hour of the night, about what this longest of imperial stories finally amounts to, because the honest accounting is stranger and better than either the legend of the effete despotism or the counter-legend of the perfect tolerant paradise. And the truth lies, as it generally does, in the difficult country between. Judged by the yardstick that the Greeks set for it, and that the West has largely accepted ever since, Persia was the great antagonist, the dark backdrop, the slavery against which freedom defined itself, the empire that lost, and by that yardstick its story is a footnote to the story of Greece, a shadow whose only function was to make the light look brighter, and that yardstick has held for 2,500 years, and it is wrong. And one of the things I have wanted to do in this long night is to take that yardstick gently out of your hands. Because it was never a fair measure. It was the propaganda of the winners in one frontier war, magnified by genius into a myth about the essential nature of East and West. And it has cost us, all of us, the ability to see clearly one of the most remarkable political achievements in the history of the species. Because judged by any fairer yardstick, the achievement is astonishing. The Persians were the first people ever to solve, even partially, the deepest problem in all of politics. The problem of how to hold together under one government in something other than a reign of terror, a great multitude of different peoples with different gods and different languages and different ways of life. Every empire before them had answered that problem with the whip and the deportation and the flayed king on the palace wall. The Assyrian answer, rule by horror, and it worked in its way, and it was hated universally and forever, and no one has ever mourned it. The Persians tried something else, something that had never been tried at scale. The idea that an empire could be a kind of contract, that you could rule 100 nations by leaving them their gods and their customs and their local law, by being a lighter and fairer master than the tyrant you replaced, by binding the whole together not with terror but with roads and records and a coinage and a system and, at least in the empire's own self-image, a kind of family feeling. The nations led up the great stairway hand in hand, and it was imperfect, and it was still an empire, built on conquest and tribute and the threat of force behind the velvet. And there were cities it crushed and peoples it deported and revolts it drowned in blood. And I have tried not to hide any of that from you, because a story that flatters is not worth your sleep. But the idea was real, and the idea was new, and the idea worked well enough to hold half the human race together for 2 centuries, and to be copied by every empire that came after, so that the very shape of large-scale government, the province and the governor and the road and the tolerated local religion and the assessed tribute, the whole architecture by which great diverse states have been ruled ever since, is at bottom the Persian invention, the answer the plateau gave to the problem of the whole world, and we have been living inside variations of that answer, without knowing whose it was, ever since. And there is the other inheritance, the deeper one, the one that runs underneath even the politics, the vision of the truth and the lie. Whatever Darius truly did on the road home from Egypt, whatever lie or truth lies buried under the great inscription on the cliff, the idea he carved there in letters tall enough to be believed, the idea that the whole cosmos is a battleground between the truth and the lie, that every human being by every choice enlists on one side or the other, that a life is judged at the last by which side it fought for, that history itself is moving toward a final triumph of the light. That idea, born on the plateau in the mind of a prophet whose very dates we cannot fix, seeped out through the long Persian centuries into the faiths of half the world, into the way that billions of people, most of them having never heard the name of Zoroaster, still frame their understanding of good and evil and judgment and the end of things, so that when a person anywhere on earth tonight thinks of their own life as a struggle, to choose the good against the evil, to speak the truth against the lie, to think good thoughts and speak good words and do good deeds, they are thinking, whether they know it or not, in the descended language of the plateau, in the words the herder prophet gave to the followers of the truth. And the fires that were the symbol of that faith still burn, small and faithful, in the last scattered communities of the Zoroastrians, a thread of flame reaching all the way back across everything we have said tonight, back past Alexander and the burning of Persepolis, back past Xerxes and Salamis, back past Darius on his cliff, and Cyrus in his little stone house, back to the deep morning of the plateau and the first tending of the sacred fire against the dark. The scribe of ancient Egypt, we said on another night, wrote that a man is dead only when his name is no longer spoken, and the Persians, who left us far fewer words of their own than the Egyptians did, who spoke to us mostly through their enemies and their monuments and the dry accounts of their working women's wages, might seem, by that measure, to have died more thoroughly than most, their own voice buried for millennia under the Greek version of their story. Their kings remembered as the villains of someone else's drama, their empire recalled as the darkness that made the Greek light look bright. And yet the names are not gone. We have said them tonight. Cyrus, who won the empire and would not destroy it. Cambyses, whom his enemies painted black. Darius, who built the machine and carved the cliff. Xerxes, who wept on the hilltop over the mortality of his own countless host. Darius III, who died in the dust as the world changed. And the nameless ones too. The herder on his rock watching the water come down. The working women of Persepolis drawing their wages of wine. The small, fearless boy who climbed the last of the cliff to bring the key of the ancient languages down off the mountain. And every time the names are said, even the names we had to reconstruct from the enemy's account and the accidental survival of a fire-baked tablet, the buried voice of the empire speaks again a little, and the Khanat runs, hidden and patient, and the water comes down. That brings us to the end of our story, and to the quiet hours when the fires have long since burned low on the terrace of the burned palace, when the great road lies empty under the stars from the coast to the mountains, and the plateau sleeps under its enormous sky, ringed by the dark walls of its mountains, its deserts silent at its heart, its buried rivers running on in the dark beneath the sleeping fields. The Highland king who would not destroy his enemies, the prophet who taught the world to see the war of the truth and the lie, the great king weeping over the shortness of the lives of all his soldiers, the last king murdered in the dust of the changing world, the small boy on the cliff. All of it has slipped quietly, gently, into the deep and settled past, into the little earth that covers the body, as Cyrus asked us not to grudge him. If you are still awake out there, thank you for staying with me through the whole long journey up onto the plateau and across the empire of the world. There is another story waiting for you on the screen whenever you are ready for it, and it will be here when you wake. If you enjoyed this one, feel free to like and subscribe, or to leave a thought down in the comments below. And if you did, leave your location and your local time so that some other sleepless traveler, somewhere far away under the same dark sky, can know they are not alone in the night. But for now, there is nothing left to do and nowhere left to be. Close your eyes and let the water come down in the dark, and let yourself drift off to sleep. Good night and sweet dreams.